Have you ever wondered why, after everything you've built, the family, the home, the career, the life you've worked so hard for, there are still nights when you lie awake staring at the ceiling? Why do I feel so restless inside? Why does my mind keep racing when the house is finally quiet? Why does my heart ache in a way no one sees? They tell us that after 40, after 50, we should have it all figured out, that life should feel settled, secure, complete. But here's the quiet truth no one talks about. Sometimes, just when life looks most put together on the outside, we feel the emptiest within. But what if this emptiness isn't a sign that something's wrong with you? What if it's an invitation, a doorway to the most meaningful chapter of your life? In this video, we'll walk together into that doorway. We'll explore a path shaped by Buddhist wisdom, by the hard-won lessons of overthinking and surrender, by the quiet miracle of discovering peace, not as something to chase, but as something that's been waiting inside you all along. By the end of this journey, you won't just have tools to quiet your mind. You'll have a new relationship with yourself, one filled with compassion, presence, and a freedom you may have thought was gone forever. So, take a deep breath. You're right where you need to be. And I'm so grateful you're here. Have you ever laid in bed at night, the house completely quiet, and felt that strange ache inside your chest? Not pain, exactly. Not sadness, either. Just empty. You've done everything you were supposed to. You raised your kids. You worked hard. You kept the house running. You checked every box on life's checklist. And yet, here you are, staring at the ceiling, wondering why your heart feels so heavy when life looks fine on the outside. If you're over 40, you know this feeling better than most. Maybe the kids have moved out. Maybe retirement is peeking around the corner. Maybe the person you thought would be by your side forever is no longer here. The world quiets down. But inside, your mind gets louder. Emily Harris knows this feeling well. She's 52, a nurse in a small town. Someone people look up to. Strong, reliable, a woman who gets things done. But at night, when the shift is over, when the uniform comes off, and when she sits alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, that's when the ache shows up. She glances at the window. The curtains are drawn. The world outside is dark, silent. For years, Emily has kept that window shut tight. Not just the window, but something in her heart, too. She doesn't want to think about the loneliness. She doesn't want to admit that she feels invisible sometimes, like she's walking through life without anyone truly seeing her. It's not just Emily. Maybe you've felt it too. Maybe you've asked yourself, why do I feel so restless even when nothing's wrong? Why do I keep replaying old conversations in my head? Why does joy feel so far away, like it slipped out the back door when I wasn't looking? That's what overthinking does. It takes ordinary moments and turns them into storms. It takes quiet evenings and fills them with noise. And after 40, it only gets louder. Because here's the truth no one tells you. As life slows down on the outside, the mind speeds up on the inside. You have more time to think, more time to look back, more space for old doubts and new fears to creep in. And unless you know how to meet that storm with something steadier, you can spend years, even decades, stuck in that restless place. One evening, Emily sat at the table, listening to the clock tick on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. She sipped her tea, tasted nothing, felt the old familiar restlessness rising. Her phone buzzed. It was her daughter, Sarah, "Love you, Mom," the text said. Just 3 words, but they landed like a stone in Emily's heart, because under the love was a reminder. Sarah was busy with her own life now. And Emily was alone in a house that had once been filled with noise and laughter. She stood up, walked to the window, and for the first time in years she pulled the curtain aside. The moon was out, big, round, glowing like a silent witness. And just for a moment, Emily let herself feel the ache. No pushing it away, no pretending she was fine. She just stood there, breathing, and whispered, "Why can't I just be at peace?" That question, simple, raw, is where everything began to shift. Because the Buddhist path doesn't start by fixing you. It doesn't begin with forcing the mind to be quiet. It begins with turning toward what you've been running from, with sitting beside your restless thoughts like you would sit beside an old friend. Buddhist wisdom says, you are not your thoughts, you are the sky. Everything else is just the weather. Imagine that. You right now reading this, you are the vast open sky. Your worries, your regrets, your what-ifs, they pass through. Some stay longer, some drift away quickly, but you remain. Emily didn't know this teaching yet, but standing at that window under the moon, something softened. She stopped trying to push the feelings away. She stopped trying to distract herself with cleaning or scrolling through her phone. She simply breathed, and for a few minutes that was enough. This is the doorway most of us miss. We think peace will come when we solve all our problems, when we stop overthinking, when life finally behaves the way we want it to. But the real doorway, the one Emily was standing in that night, is learning to stay present even when the mind is noisy, even when the heart is heavy. And here's the beautiful twist. The moment you stop fighting the storm begins to lose its power over you. As Emily turned away from the window, she felt something shift inside. No, her problems weren't solved. No, the loneliness didn't magically vanish. But she had taken the first brave step toward change. She had faced herself with honesty. In the coming weeks, that moment at the window would come back to her again and again. When she felt anxious at work, when she missed Sarah's voice, when she woke up at 3 a.m., mind racing, she would remember the moon, the stillness, the breath. She would remember that peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's the presence of compassion for yourself in the middle of it. And maybe, as you sit reading this, you can feel it too. You don't have to wait for your life to be perfect. You don't have to silence every thought before you can feel calm. You just have to pause, to breathe, to whisper to yourself, I am here, I am enough. So tonight, if you find yourself wide awake staring at the ceiling, I invite you to do what Emily did. Go to the window, let the moonlight touch your face. Feel the cool night air on your skin. Place a hand over your heart, and without needing to fix anything, without needing to figure it all out, just tell yourself, I am still here. I am still standing. And that's enough for now, because sometimes the most powerful beginning is not in doing something big. It's in daring to stop running. And Emily, though she didn't know it yet, had just stepped into a new chapter of her life. One where overthinking no longer ran the show. One where peace was waiting quietly, right on the other side of a single breath. The next morning, Emily woke early. just as she always did. The sunlight was sneaking through the curtains, casting thin golden stripes across the floor. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that once made her restless. But something felt different today. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, her feet touching the cool wooden floor. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her own body, the rhythm of her own breath. Yesterday, standing by the window, something had cracked open inside her. Just a little, just enough to make her wonder. What if I stopped running from my thoughts? She walked into the kitchen, made herself a cup of coffee, and instead of turning on the TV or scrolling through her phone, she sat. Just sat. The coffee warmed her hands. The smell filled the room. And there, in that small moment, something remarkable happened. Her mind, of course, began its usual dance. Did I pay that bill? Did I say the right thing to Sarah yesterday? What if I'm just wasting time sitting here? But instead of pushing those thoughts away, instead of drowning in them, Emily remembered the moonlight from the night before. She imagined her thoughts like clouds passing across the sky of her mind, and she whispered to herself, "It's okay. I see you. Keep moving." Here's the thing most people don't realize. Overthinking isn't the enemy. It's the body's confused way of trying to protect you. The mind spins its wheels, searching for answers, searching for control. Because it believes if it can just figure everything out, you'll finally feel safe. But the safety we crave doesn't come from controlling life. It comes from softening into it. Buddhist wisdom teaches that life is like a river, always moving, always changing. You can fight the current and exhaust yourself, or you can learn to float, to trust, to let the water carry you. That morning, Emily took her first lesson in floating. She sat. She breathed. She allowed her mind to chatter without letting it drag her under. And when her heart began to race, when the old familiar tension tightened across her shoulders, she placed a hand on her chest and whispered, "I am here." And something softened. Later that day, Emily went about her routines, laundry, errands, tidying up. She caught herself a few times lost in thought, worrying over small things. But each time she noticed, she smiled softly. "Oh, there you are again," she'd think. And then she would come back to the present moment. The feeling of her hands folding the clothes, the sound of her footsteps on the floor, the sunlight warming her face as she stepped outside. Emily was beginning to practice something the Buddha called the middle way, the path between extremes. Not forcing herself to stop thinking, not drowning in thought either, but walking the gentle path of awareness between them. One afternoon, her neighbor Linda knocked on the door. Linda was flustered, papers in hand, worried over some bills and appointments. In the past, Emily would have joined her in the storm, rushing to fix, to advise, to manage. But this time, Emily paused. She invited Linda in, made her a cup of tea, and they sat together at the table. For a moment they were both still. "I just feel so overwhelmed," Linda confessed, her voice cracking. Emily placed her hand gently over Linda's and said, "I know. I really do. But let's take one thing at a time." They sorted through the papers together, slow and steady, and something remarkable unfolded. Emily realized that her own calm was now touching the people around her. The peace she was learning to cultivate wasn't just for herself. It was becoming a gift she could offer to others. That evening, as Emily sat on her porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, she thought about all the years she had spent tangled in her mind. All the nights lying awake, all the hours spent chasing worries, and she realized none of it had ever brought her closer to peace. The peace came not from solving every problem, but from being willing to sit with life as it is, to breathe with it, to soften around it. And here's the twist. The moment that surprised even Emily, the more she stopped trying to control her thoughts, the less power they had over her. Like a child throwing a tantrum that quiets when you no longer react. The mind settles when it no longer feels the need to scream for attention. Emily began keeping a small notebook by her bed. Each night, before sleep, she would write down 3 things she noticed that day. Not big achievements, not milestones, just small, quiet things. The warmth of the coffee cup in the morning, the way the light hit the kitchen wall at noon, the sound of Linda's laughter over tea. And each night as she closed the notebook, Emily felt herself exhale into a deeper kind of rest. Not the rest of exhaustion, but the rest of trust. Because here's what she was learning, and maybe it's what you need to hear too. Peace isn't a prize you win when you finally fix yourself. It's a practice you begin right here, right now, in the middle of your imperfect, beautiful, messy life. So tonight, when the house quiets down, when the old familiar ache stirs in your chest, I invite you to do what Emily did. Sit with it. Breathe with it. Whisper to yourself, I am here. I am enough. And slowly, gently watch as the storm inside you begins to soften. Emily didn't know it yet, but her quiet experiment with sitting and breathing was about to meet its first real test. Because life, as it always does, was waiting with a curveball. It was a Thursday afternoon when she got the call. Her daughter, Rachel, who lived 2 states away, was going through a divorce. The words poured out over the phone. The heartbreak, the exhaustion, the sharp edge of disappointment. Rachel's voice cracked, trembling through the line, and Emily felt that old wave rise up inside her. The urge to fix, to fly out the door, book a flight, arrive with bags of solutions, and a heart too full to carry. But as she stood there in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, something in Emily paused. She remembered the breath. She remembered the river. And instead of launching into advice or action, she said softly, "Oh, honey, that sounds so heavy. I'm here with you." And then she was quiet. That silence, it wasn't empty, it was spacious. It wrapped around Rachel like arms that reached through the miles, and on the other end Rachel exhaled the first real breath she had taken in days. "Thanks, Mom," she whispered. "I didn't even know how much I needed to hear that." That was Emily's twist. She was discovering that surrender was not weakness. It wasn't giving up. It was giving into the moment, into presence, into a kind of love that doesn't need to fix or hold or control. Buddhist wisdom teaches that compassion is not about removing someone's pain, but about being fully present with them in it. That night, Emily sat on her porch, the cool air brushing against her skin, and thought about how many times in her life she had confused love with control, how often she had tried to manage, arrange rescue, when all anyone really needed was for her to show up and stay. The next morning, as she walked through the park near her house, Emily noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. The way the dew clung to the grass, the quiet chatter of the birds overhead, a dog chasing its own tail in circles, completely lost in the joy of the moment. And as she walked, a memory floated up. The day she had dropped Rachel off at college years ago, standing at the curb holding back tears, pretending to be strong. She had wanted to tell Rachel everything then. How to make friends, how to study, how to protect her heart. But the only words that had come out were, "Call me if you need anything." Now, walking alone, Emily realized that was enough. That had always been enough. Later that week, Emily joined a local meditation group. It was a small circle of people. Some young, some old, gathered in a quiet room above a bookstore. They sat together in silence, eyes closed, hands resting in their laps. At first, Emily's mind raced. She thought about laundry, bills, Rachel, what to cook for dinner. But then she remembered what she had been practicing, the art of noticing without clinging. She let the thoughts rise and fall like waves, coming and going. And in that quiet room, surrounded by strangers, Emily felt a warmth bloom in her chest. She was not alone. Here's the beautiful paradox. The more we practice surrender, the more we begin to feel connected. Not because we're clinging to each other, but because we're standing side by side in the rawness of being human. Buddhist teachings call this interbeing, the understanding that we are all threads in the same vast tapestry, held together not by control, but by presence. A few days later, Emily's neighbor Linda knocked again, this time with a small pot of daisies in her hands. "For you," Linda said, smiling shyly. "Just thank you for the other day." Emily took the flowers, touched by the gesture. She placed them on her windowsill, the one that now stayed open most days. As the breeze drifted in, ruffling the curtains, Emily watched the petals tremble slightly in the wind. And she thought, this is the practice. This is the practice. This is the life I've been running from. Messy, unpredictable, sometimes painful, but stunning in its small, ordinary gifts. That evening, Emily pulled out her notebook and wrote, Rachel's voice softening over the phone. The dew on the grass in the morning light, daisies on the windowsill, dancing in the breeze. She closed the notebook, placed it by her bed, and lay down. And as she drifted towards sleep, Emily felt the kind of quiet that no amount of overthinking had ever been able to buy her. The twist, she realized, was not in escaping life's storms. It was in learning how to stay, to breathe, and to love through them. And that, dear listener, is where the real transformation begins. Emily thought the hardest part of her journey would be calming her own restless mind. But as the days passed, she began to see something unexpected. The calm she was building inside wasn't staying locked in her chest. It was spilling outward gently, quietly, into the lives around her. It started with small moments. At work, when a younger colleague rushed into her office, breathless and panicked over a missed deadline, Emily did something the old version of herself never would have done. She put her pen down, folded her hands, and said calmly, "Take a deep breath. Let's look at it together." The younger woman blinked, surprised. And in that small pause, something softened between them. On a walk through the neighborhood, Emily noticed an elderly man struggling to carry groceries up his front steps. For a moment she hesitated. She was running late after all, but then she heard that quiet whisper inside, the one that had become her new companion. Slow down. Be here. She walked over, offered a hand, and together they climbed the steps. The man thanked her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and Emily felt something loosen inside her chest, a knot she hadn't even known she was carrying. That evening, back at home, Emily brewed a cup of tea and sat by her open window. The daisies from Linda still sat on the windowsill, a little wilted now, but still lovely. As the wind moved through the room, she closed her eyes and took a breath. And in that breath she understood something she had only glimpsed before, that healing is not just a personal project. It's contagious, it's contagious, it's communal. When you soften, you invite others to soften. When you slow down, you give others permission to slow too. The next morning, Emily decided to try something bold. She invited a few neighbors over for tea. Linda, the young couple from next door, and even the quiet widower from across the street. They sat in Emily's living room, mugs in hand, awkward at first, unsure of why they were there. But Emily kept the conversation simple. She asked about their days, their families, their worries. She listened without rushing to fill the silence. And as the minutes passed, the awkwardness melted. Laughter bubbled up. Stories were shared. For the first time in years, Emily's home felt full. Not with noise or chaos, but with the gentle hum of human connection. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that we all suffer in some way, and that the path to freedom isn't about removing suffering, but about walking through it together. Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "Compassion is a verb." Emily was beginning to understand that. It wasn't just about sitting on her cushion, breathing in solitude. It was about showing up, open-hearted, for the people around her. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and pink, Emily stood by her window again. She thought about Rachel, who was still navigating her divorce, about Linda, who was learning to trust people again after years of keeping to herself, about the young man at the cafe, the elderly neighbor, her colleagues at work. And it hit her. The circle of healing was so much larger than she had ever imagined. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to fix anyone. She just needed to keep showing up, breathing, listening, offering her quiet presence like an anchor in the storm. That night, Emily wrote in her journal, helped the neighbor with his groceries, hosted tea for the first time in years, sat in the quiet, feeling the world expand. She closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay in bed. And as sleep began to gather her in, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. A sense of belonging. Not the kind that comes from being needed or from proving herself useful, but the kind that comes from simply being part of the human fabric, stitched together by kindness, vulnerability, and the quiet miracle of showing up. The twist was clear now. Emily's healing had never been just about herself. It was a ripple, a wave, a small but powerful force of softness moving through her world. And as she drifted off, she smiled at the thought. Maybe this was the real work of aging, the real task of the second half of life, not to build or accomplish or conquer, but to connect, to soften, to become a gentle presence in a world that so desperately needs it. Emily once believed that peace would come when everything in her life was finally in place, when her career was steady, when her children were settled, when her body stopped aching, when the past no longer pulled at her heart. She thought peace was something just over the next hill, waiting patiently for her to arrive. But at 52, standing at the window of her quiet home, Emily was beginning to understand something that Buddhist wisdom has whispered for centuries. Peace does not wait for the conditions of life to be perfect. Peace waits for you to turn toward life, just as it is. It was a windy autumn afternoon when the truth of this finally sank in. Emily was walking through the park, leaves crunching beneath her feet. Scarf tugged tight against the cold. The air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke. She passed families playing, joggers pounding the trail, couples lost in conversation. And then, at the edge of the lake, she stopped. The water rippled wildly in the wind, sending tiny waves skittering across the surface. A single, weathered bench sat facing the lake, and on it a man about her age sat alone, staring at the water. Without quite knowing why, Emily walked over and sat down at the far end of the bench. For a few minutes, they sat in silence. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the swirl of her thoughts. Should I say something? Is he okay? Will he think I'm strange? But then the man spoke, voice soft, without turning his head. Funny, isn't it? How the world just keeps moving, no matter what's going on inside you. Emily nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. It really is. They sat a little longer. Then, almost as if he could sense her heart, the man added, My wife passed last year. I come here sometimes just to remember I'm still part of things. Emily felt a tightness rise in her throat. I lost someone too, she murmured, and then, without thinking, she placed her hand on the bench, palm open, a small offering of presents. They didn't need to say much more. In that simple moment, two strangers sitting beside the wild, restless water, Emily saw something she had missed for so many years. Life was never going to stop being uncertain. There would always be waves, always be wind, always be moments when the heart aches and the future feels blurry. But maybe, just maybe, the work was not to quiet the storm, but to find her ground inside it. That evening, back at home, Emily pulled out an old photo album she hadn't touched in years. She flipped through the pages slowly. Her children as toddlers, her wedding day, snapshots of vacations and birthdays and everyday joys. Each image was a doorway into a moment she could never get back. And yet, instead of tightening her chest, the pictures softened something inside her. She saw, maybe for the first time, that every season of her life had been a wave, rising, breaking, dissolving into the next. She closed the album, set it gently on the table, and sat in the quiet. Her breath moved in and out, a rhythm as old as the earth. And in that rhythm, Emily found a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of certainty, but the peace of surrender. In Buddhism, there's a teaching called anicca, impermanence. It tells us that everything we cling to will one day change, fade, or pass away. To the untrained heart, this feels like bad news, but to the heart that has softened, it is the most liberating truth of all, because when you stop trying to grip life so tightly, your hands are free to touch it with tenderness. Emily began to live from this place. When she called her children, she listened with more patience, knowing they were busy carving out their own lives. When a neighbor complained about something petty, she smiled instead of bristling, sensing the smallness of the grievance in the grand scheme of things. When old fears arose at night, she placed a hand on her chest and whispered, "This too belongs." And then came the real test. Emily was diagnosed with a minor but persistent health condition. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to shake her sense of stability. The old Emily would have spiraled into anxiety, consumed by questions. Why me? What now? Will I be okay? But this time she surprised herself. She sat quietly in the doctor's office, hands folded in her lap. She listened carefully. She asked the questions she needed to ask, and when she left the office, stepping into the cool autumn air, she took a long, steady breath. She realized nothing had fundamentally changed. She was still here, still breathing, still able to touch the moment with care. That night, Emily wrote in her journal, sat by the lake, met a stranger, looked through old photos, felt gratitude instead of grief, faced my own uncertainty with a little more grace. She paused, pen hovering above the page, and then she wrote something she hadn't quite believed until now. I am learning to trust the unknown. The twist was not that Emily had finally figured everything out. It was that she no longer needed to. The craving for answers, the desperate need to tie up every loose end, had softened into something far more beautiful. The ability to rest inside the questions themselves. As Emily turned out the light that night, she whispered one final thought into the dark. Thank you for this messy, mysterious, unfinished life. And in that quiet, without fanfare, she crossed a threshold. Not into a life without challenges, but into a life held with open hands. It was a chilly December morning when Emily first realized how far she had come. She stood in line at the grocery store, waiting with a loaf of bread, some oranges, and a carton of milk in her basket. In front of her, a young mother wrestled with a fussy toddler, fumbling for her wallet as the little boy cried and kicked his feet against the shopping cart. The old Emily, the one from years ago, would have felt impatient. She would have tapped her foot, sighed quietly, and wished the line would just move along. But now Emily felt something else entirely. She saw herself, not literally, but with the kind of gentle recognition that comes from a heart that has been cracked open and slowly stitched itself back together. Without thinking, she leaned forward, smiled warmly at the mother, and said, "Take your time. We've all been there." The woman's eyes filled with tears, caught between exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Just 2 words, but in them was the entire world. Emily left the store that day with more than groceries. She walked out with a quiet, glowing realization. She was no longer just healing herself. She was becoming someone who could hold space for the healing of others. Buddhist wisdom has a beautiful word for this: bodhicitta, the awakened heart. It's the moment when your personal journey of awakening naturally spills over into compassion for those around you. You don't have to be a saint. You don't have to have it all figured out. You simply become a lighthouse, steady in your own small way, offering light to anyone who happens to be drifting nearby. Over the next few months, Emily began to notice the ripple effect. She found herself lingering after yoga class to chat with the woman who always rolled up her mat too quickly, the one who looked like she might break into tears if anyone dared to ask, "How are you really?" She started volunteering once a week at the library, reading stories to children whose parents worked late. She even reached out to her estranged sister, not with an agenda not to fix the relationship, but simply to say, "I'm here when you're ready." And the real twist, The thing that made Emily's transformation so quietly astonishing was this: none of these actions were grand. They were small, almost invisible. But they came from a place of deep, grounded presence. One afternoon, as snow fell softly outside, Emily sat by her window, the same window where, months ago, she had first wrestled with the restless ache of overthinking. She sipped her tea, watched the snow settle on the branches, and thought about a line she had once read from the Buddha. As a mother would protect her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. She closed her eyes, breathed in, breathed out, and felt into the vastness of those words. She wasn't perfect. She still had days when old worries crept in like shadows across the floor. But now, she met those worries with kindness, as if comforting a small child. And in doing so, she had become someone who could extend that same kindness to the world. One evening, Emily's neighbor, a retired widower named Tom, knocked on her door. He was holding a small battered radio in his hands. "Emily," he said, "this old thing stopped working. I don't know why, but I thought you might, I don't know, want to listen to it with me one last time?" So they sat together on Emily's porch, wrapped in blankets, the broken radio between them. Tom fiddled with the dials, but all they could get was faint static and the occasional crackle of a distant station. And then Emily, with that same quiet magic she was learning to trust, said, "Maybe it's not about the music, Tom. Maybe it's just about sitting here together." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that breaks open the heart. "Maybe you're right," he said. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she understood something she wished she had known all along. The journey was never about fixing every part of her life. It was about learning how to be present with life as it unfolded, messy, unpredictable, tender, and wild. She thought about how much time she had once wasted chasing peace, as if it were a prize at the end of some race. And now, here it was, sitting quietly beside her on a cold night, wrapped in blankets, listening to static on an old radio with a neighbor who just wanted not to be alone. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the final stage of healing is not when you feel done, but when you begin to serve. Not out of duty, not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because your own awakening overflows naturally into the lives of others. Emily smiled in the dark, a soft, private smile. She was becoming a lighthouse, not to save anyone, not to light up the whole world, but simply to stand in her place, steady and shining, for whoever might need a bit of warmth on their way home. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was what all her overthinking had been leading her toward all along. Emily once believed peace was something loud, something triumphant. She thought it would arrive with a rush, sweeping her up like a great wave, washing away her overthinking, her worries, her restless nights. But what she learned, what life had slowly, tenderly revealed, was that peace does not knock on the door like a grand visitor. It slips in quietly, like sunlight through a window you forgot you left open. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of soft gray morning that made the world feel hushed and reflective. Emily sat by the window with her tea, the old radio still resting on the shelf. Outside, the neighborhood stirred slowly awake. The sound of a newspaper landing on a porch, the murmur of voices from the sidewalk, the bark of a dog chasing a squirrel through last autumn's leaves. Inside there was a stillness that felt earned, like a well-worn armchair or a favorite sweater pulled from the back of a drawer. Emily closed her eyes and let the quiet fill her, let it settle into her chest like a kind of knowing. She no longer fought the thoughts when they came. She no longer saw them as invaders, but as weather, clouds moving across the sky of her mind. And here's the real twist, the gentle surprise she never saw coming. She had stopped waiting for peace to feel perfect, because it turned out peace was not the absence of pain, or the complete stillness of mind, or the flawless control over every detail of life. Peace was simply this: the ability to be with whatever arose, without needing to run away. As the morning unfolded, Emily moved through her house with quiet intention. She watered the plants, humming softly to herself. She sorted laundry, smiling at the familiar rhythm of folding shirts and matching socks. She paused at the bookshelf, fingers trailing over the spines of well-loved books. Every task became a kind of meditation, a way of touching life without rushing past it. Later that day, she took a walk to the park. There, on a weathered bench, she found Tom, her neighbor, feeding breadcrumbs to a gathering of pigeons. He looked up as she approached, his face lighting up with a grin. "Emily," he called out, "you have perfect timing. These birds were just asking about you." She laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the belly, unguarded and free. Sitting beside Tom, she watched the birds scatter and return, scatter and return. She marveled at their simple persistence, the way they trusted life enough to keep coming back, no matter how many times they were startled away. "Funny, isn't it?" Tom mused. "They're scared half the time, but they still show up for crumbs." Emily smiled, the truth of it warming her from the inside. "Yeah," she said softly, "we all do." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of amber and rose, Emily felt something inside her shift, not dramatically, not like a lightning strike, but like the soft click of a door quietly swinging open. She realized she had arrived, not at the end of her journey, but at the beginning of a new one. A journey where peace was not a destination, but a companion. Buddhist wisdom teaches that enlightenment is not about escaping the human experience, but about inhabiting it fully with an open and undefended heart. Emily understood now that the greatest gift of mindfulness was not the ability to silence her mind, but the ability to stay present with her life, moment by precious moment. As she walked home that evening, the cool air brushing against her cheeks, Emily whispered a quiet thank you into the twilight. Not to any particular person or force, but to life itself, messy, unpredictable, tender light. Back home she stood once again at her window. She opened it wide, letting in the night air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car door shut, a child's laughter floated on the breeze. Emily closed her eyes, placed a hand over her heart, and simply breathed. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to fix anything. She didn't need to outrun her thoughts or perfect her life or earn her rest. She was here. She was enough. She was home. And maybe that is what the whole journey had been about. Not about changing who she was, but about remembering who she had always been beneath the noise. Emily turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and as her head touched the pillow, she smiled. Outside, the night stretched wide and calm. Inside, Emily drifted towards sleep, not because her mind was finally silent, but because she had learned to rest within its song. As we close this journey together, I want you to pause. Feel your breath. Feel the weight of your own hands resting on your lap. Notice the quiet around you and the even quieter space inside. You've just traveled through stories of doubt, of overthinking, of loneliness, and you've discovered that peace was never somewhere far away. It was right here, all along, in the space between your thoughts, in the small, ordinary moments you once rushed past. So tonight, when the old habits come calling, when the mind spins its endless what-ifs, when the heart aches with old questions, place a hand over your heart and remind yourself, I am here, I am enough, I can rest. And if this journey touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might be lying awake right now, searching for the same kind of peace. Leave a comment with your story. You never know whose heart it might reach. And if you'd like to walk more of this path together, subscribe to join a circle of people just like you, seekers, healers, ordinary souls learning to befriend their minds, one breath at a time. Remember, you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are home. Have you ever woken up at 60 or somewhere near it and wondered quietly, how did I end up here? Not in a dramatic way, not in a storm of regret, but in the soft hush of a morning when the coffee is cooling in your hands, the window is closed, and the world outside feels just a little out of reach. Have you ever felt that quiet ache? Not exactly sadness, not exactly loneliness, just a sense that somewhere along the way you drifted from the person you once were. Today, I want to invite you into a story. Not a story about fixing yourself, not a story about doing more or being more, but a story about remembering, about opening, about finding your way back to yourself, gently, tenderly, one small breath at a time. This isn't a guidebook or a lecture. It's a companion for those moments when you sit by the window wondering where life went and how to feel alive again. So come, sit with me. Let's open a little window together. You may just find that the peace you've been searching for has been here, waiting, all along. Have you ever woken up just before sunrise, when the world is still draped in that soft silvery light, and felt something stir in your chest, a quiet ache, a restless whisper you can't quite name? You sit on the edge of your bed, feet touching the cool floor, the house hushed around you. Outside the window, the world is already moving, the trees shifting, the wind brushing past rooftops, but inside, there's a stillness that almost hums. And in that stillness, a question drifts through your mind. How did I get here? For Emily Harris, 62 years old, retired school teacher, the question had become a familiar companion. She did not always have words for it. Some mornings it came as a flutter in her chest, a sense that something was missing. Other mornings it came more sharply, when she looked around her quiet home and wondered when exactly it had started feeling like someone else's life. Emily lived in a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches, and where the grocery clerk asked about your grandkids, even if you didn't have any. Her house sat at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac, yellow paint peeling just slightly on the shutters, a wind chime on the kitchen window that hadn't moved in years because the window had been shut for just as long. On this morning, As the sun teased its way over the horizon, Emily moved through the house the way she always did. She brewed coffee, poured it into the same chipped mug, and sat by the window. But instead of turning on the news or scrolling through her phone, she just sat. She watched the way the light stretched across the kitchen table, touching the vase of dried flowers she had meant to throw away months ago. She noticed the way the steam rose from her cup, curling and disappearing into the air. And as she watched, a memory arrived, not invited, but gentle. She remembered a time years ago when mornings were noisy. The sound of her husband, Michael, rustling through the closet, her kids laughing as they got ready for school, the dog's paws clicking on the floor. Back then, the house had been alive. Now, it was a sanctuary, and also, sometimes, a desert. Emily breathed in slowly. It's strange, she thought, how you can have everything you need, the pension, the roof over your head, the freedom of retirement, and still feel untethered, as though you were a boat that had quietly drifted from its dock. She sipped her coffee, letting its warmth hold her just a little longer, and wondered if anyone else felt this way. Did John across the street, who spent his days mowing the lawn and feeding the neighborhood squirrels? Did Margaret next door, with her book clubs and gardening, ever feel the same ache at night when the house settled into silence? The Buddhist teachers Emily had read would say that suffering begins the moment we resist what is, that the ache she felt wasn't from having lost her sense of self, but from grasping at an old version of it. She knew the words. She had underlined them in books and circled them in articles. But knowing and living, those were oceans apart. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let her mind wander. A soft knock on the window startled her. She opened her eyes to see a robin pecking gently at the glass. It paused, tilted its head, and then flew off, leaving behind only the faintest imprint of its presence. A smudge of breath, a whisper of life. Emily watched it disappear into the trees and felt something stir inside her, a reminder she hadn't asked for. Perhaps it's not about chasing after something new, she thought. Perhaps it's about noticing what is still here. But then came the familiar tug in her chest. That sense of not knowing where to put her hands, her heart, her time. Retirement had offered her freedom, yes, but also the unraveling of routine, of purpose. She missed the feeling of being needed, of walking into her classroom and hearing a dozen little voices call her name. She missed the small chaos of her old life, the noise, the movement, the endless string of tiny crises that had, in their way, made her feel anchored to the world. Now her days stretched out like open road, and sometimes the silence felt like a weight. Emily's fingers brushed the wind chime at the window, the one Michael had given her on their anniversary 20 years ago. She could still remember the sound it used to make, delicate and light, a music that danced on the breeze. But she had stopped opening the window after Michael passed away, after the house emptied out, after the seasons began to blur together. What if, she wondered, the simple act of opening a window could change something? She felt silly thinking it. And yet, something in her softened at the idea. Outside, sun climbed a little higher. Light spilled across the trees, catching in the leaves, turning the world gold for just a moment. Emily watched as a neighbor jogged past, as a car rolled slowly down the street, as the world kept turning without her. She exhaled long and slow. In Buddhism, there's a teaching that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. Emily did not know what form that teacher might take, or if she was even ready. But in that moment, with the robin's shadow still flickering in her mind and the wind chime trembling beneath her fingers, She wondered if perhaps the first lesson was simply to sit, to be still, to let the ache in her chest be just that, an ache, not a problem to be solved. As she sat, a memory surfaced, a line Michael used to say when life got hard. Breathe, Em. Just breathe. It's all happening, whether you fight it or not. The words made her chest tighten and soften all at once. She closed her eyes and drew in a deep breath, feeling the air fill her, noticing the rise of her shoulders, the slow fall as she let it go. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to push the ache away. She let it be part of the morning. She opened her eyes again and looked at the window. The wind chimes stirred, just barely, as if it too were waiting. In that stillness, a thought drifted through her, gentle, persistent, like the breeze she hadn't felt in years. Maybe today she would open the window. Maybe today she would let the wind in. The ache in her chest didn't disappear, but it shifted, just a little, as though it had been seen, acknowledged, folded into the light of the new day. And somewhere deep inside her, Emily felt it. The smallest spark of something that wasn't quite joy or clarity or peace, but the quiet beginning of all three. Have you ever felt that way? As though life was waiting, just outside your window, for you to open it again. Emily woke that morning with the memory of the robin still lingering in her chest. It was funny, she thought, how something so small, the flutter of wings against a window, could stir something so deep. She shuffled into the kitchen, the house creaking softly beneath her feet, and stood once more at the window. Outside, the world was already busy. Cars humming down the street, the neighbor's dog barking, the mail truck rolling by. But inside Emily's home, the quiet was so complete it felt like another presence, a second heartbeat she carried through the day. She wrapped her hands around a fresh cup of coffee, its warmth grounding her for a moment, and let her eyes drift to the wind chime. It had been years since she opened that window. The thought crossed her mind again. Maybe today. But her hands stayed still. Instead, she carried her coffee to the couch and settled into the spot she always chose, the one where the cushions were worn just enough to cradle her weight. On the coffee table sat a stack of mail she hadn't opened, a reminder of birthdays she'd missed, invitations she'd quietly declined. There was a time when Emily had been the first to RSVP, the one to organize potlucks and surprise parties. But over the years, as the house grew quieter, so had she. It wasn't that she didn't want to connect. It was that she no longer knew how to show up in a room where her old role, the teacher, the wife, the busy mother, no longer fit. She leaned back and let her mind wander to the faces she hadn't seen in months. Margaret with her garden full of sunflowers. John across the street, forever fixing his old truck. Even Jessica, the young mom 2 houses down, always chasing her little girl with a tired laugh. They were all there, just outside the window. And yet somehow, Emily felt as though she was watching life from the other side of a glass wall. The Buddhist teachers speak of this ache, the ache of disconnection, of feeling separate from the great web of life. They remind us that we suffer most not from loss itself, but from the stories we weave around it. Emily wondered what story she had been telling herself all these years. That she was no longer needed, that she had become invisible. that the best chapters of her life were already written. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of those thoughts settle in her body. They were heavy, but familiar, like an old coat she had forgotten to take off. When she opened her eyes, her gaze fell again on the wind chime. It was a simple thing: thin metal tubes, a wooden disc, and a small heart-shaped charm that danced in the center. Michael had picked it out on their trip to Maine years before the cancer, years before the long winter of hospitals and waiting rooms. Emily could still remember the way he laughed as he hung it up, saying, "Let's let the wind sing to us a little, Anne." Back then she had loved the sound of it, the way it filled the house with a kind of music that made even ordinary mornings feel touched by grace. But after Michael was gone, the music felt like a wound. So she shut the window, and over time, the house fell silent. Emily reached out now, almost without thinking, and let her fingers brush the metal tubes. They gave a soft, hesitant note, like a voice that had been silent too long. In that moment she felt it, the sharp sting of memory, the bittersweet ache of love that has outlived its object. And for the first time in years, she let herself sit with it without flinching away. Outside, a child's laugh echoed down the street. Emily smiled a little sadly and wondered if the child was Jessica's daughter, Sophie. She remembered how Sophie used to wave at her from the sidewalk, how Emily would smile and wave back, and how over time those small exchanges had faded into polite nods and then into absence. The truth was, Emily had been the one to pull away. She had retreated not just from the world, but from herself. And now, in the stillness of her living room, with the sun casting long beams across the carpet, she realized she was ready to return. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the quietest way she knew. By opening the window. Her heart beat a little faster at the thought. It seemed ridiculous, almost laughable, that such a small act could matter. But deep inside, in a place beyond words, Emily knew it did. She rose from the couch, coffee still warm in her hands, and walked to the window. Her fingers hovered over the latch. Outside, the world waited. The Buddhist teachers remind us that awakening doesn't come through grand gestures. It comes in the smallest moments. The breath you notice, the flower you tend, the window you dare to open. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the latch. But then, just as she was about to turn it, a knock sounded at the door. She froze. For a moment she thought about pretending she wasn't home. But something in her heart, something tired of retreating, urged her forward. When she opened the door, there stood Jessica, holding Sophie by the hand. The little girl beamed up at Emily, her face lit with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. "Hi, Emily," Jessica said softly. "Sorry to bother you." Sophie wanted to say hello. Emily's heart softened. She crouched down to Sophie's level. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice a little rusty from disuse. "It's so nice to see you." Sophie grinned and held out a small paper heart. "I made this for you," she said. Emily took the gift with trembling hands. On it, in careful crayon letters, was written, "Thank you for waving at me." Tears sprang to Emily's eyes, unexpected and fierce. She had not known she had been seen. She had not known she had been. She had not known she mattered. As Jessica and Sophie walked away, Emily closed the door softly and turned back to the window. This time, without hesitation, she slid the latch and pushed the window open. The wind rushed in, cool and sweet, lifting the curtains, brushing her face, making the wind chimes sing for the first time in years. Emily closed her eyes, breathed in the scent of the world outside, and felt something loosen inside her, something old and tight and ready at last to let go. And in that moment, with the wind at her face and the paper heart in her hand, Emily knew she was not lost. She was not finished. She was simply beginning again. Have you ever stood at the edge of a quiet day, wondering if you could step back into life? Maybe today is your day. Maybe like Emily, all you need to do is open the window. It had been 3 days since Emily opened the window. 3 quiet, slow, utterly ordinary days. But something had shifted. Not in the world outside. The trees still rustled with the same late summer wind. The neighborhood kids still rode their bikes in crooked circles. The mail still came at exactly 10:15 every morning. No. What had shifted was inside her, and it wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change that lives just beneath the skin, like the faint warmth after the sun touches your arm. Each morning now, Emily made her coffee and sat by that window. The same spot as always, but different somehow. She no longer stared through the glass like a woman watching the world go on without her. She sat with the breeze brushing across her face, with the wind chime gently singing, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a visitor in her own life. But healing isn't a straight line. On the 4th morning, it happened. Emily woke up feeling that old heaviness again. Not a sadness she could name. Just fog. It clung to her as she moved through the house, making everything feel muted. Her coffee didn't taste right. The sunlight felt too harsh. The wind chime's sound felt distant. She sat on the couch with her hands in her lap, still wearing her bathrobe, and thought to herself, what if that moment at the window? What if that was just a fluke? What if I was never meant to feel alive again? The mind has a way of pulling us back, even when we start to let go, even when we glimpse the sky through the trees. The mind whispers, don't trust this. You're too old. It's too late. Emily picked up the paper heart that Sophie had given her. She turned it over in her hands, her thumb tracing the creased edge. It still held the faint smell of crayons and glue. She remembered the look in Sophie's eyes, so bright, so certain. But now her heart felt numb. She set the heart down and walked slowly to the kitchen. On the counter was a small book, one she hadn't touched in years. Pieces every step by Thich Nhat Hanh. Michael had given it to her after her first year of teaching, when she used to come home exhausted, shoulders tense from holding everyone else's needs. She opened the book at random. One line stood out. You are already enough. There is no need to run anymore. Emily closed the book. She whispered the sentence out loud, almost like a prayer. You are already enough. There is no need to run anymore. She sat down again, and this time, instead of pushing the fog away, she let it be there. Just like the Buddhist teachers said, don't resist the rain, let it pass through. She thought back to how she had lived for decades, always busy, always reaching for the next thing. When the kids were young, it was school lunches, dance recitals, summer camps. When she was working, it was lesson plans, parent meetings, PTA fundraisers. After Michael passed, it became distractions, fixing the yard, cleaning the garage, watching television until she fell asleep on the couch. It wasn't that she didn't feel. It was that she had become so good at outrunning her feelings. And now there was nowhere left to run. The silence in the house wasn't chasing her. It was inviting her to finally listen. She looked down at her hands, aging hands soft with time. She thought of all the chalk those hands had held, all the tears they had wiped from children's cheeks, all the meals they had cooked for people she loved. These hands had given so much, and now they trembled slightly, not from weakness, from the courage it takes to stop running. Emily walked back to the window. She opened it wider this time, letting the breeze fill the kitchen. She looked out across the lawn, where the old oak tree stood, the one Michael had planted on their 10th anniversary. The tree had changed too. Its branches were thinner, a few leaves already yellowing in the late summer sun. But it stood strong. It had roots. It didn't need to prove anything anymore. Emily exhaled slowly. She felt her shoulders drop, her chest soften. She whispered again, "You are already enough. There is no need to run anymore." And that's when she saw her. Jessica, standing outside, holding Sophie's hand, waving up at Emily's window. Emily raised her hand in return, and to her surprise, Jessica walked up the path. When Emily opened the door, Jessica gave a shy smile. "Hey," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting. Sophie just wanted to ask something." Sophie peeked out from behind her mother's legs. "Miss Emily, will you come to my story day at school next Friday? I'm supposed to bring someone who tells good stories." Emily blinked. Her heart did a strange thing. A squeeze, then a lift. Well, I haven't told a story in a long time," she said. Sophie grinned. "That's okay. You can just read one. I like your voice." Emily looked at Jessica, who nodded gently. And in that moment, something that had been closed for years opened. "I'd love to," Emily said. When they left, she stood at the door for a long time, and she smiled because the ache didn't go away, but it changed, it softened, it made room for something else. Hope. It's strange, isn't it, that sometimes healing doesn't begin with a big realization. Sometimes it starts with a child's invitation, a breeze, a story. Emily turned to the wind chime and let it sing. That night, she sat by the window as the sun slipped below the trees. She didn't need answers. She just needed to keep showing up. She just needed to keep showing up. And you? Have you stopped running yet? Have you paused long enough to hear your own breath? Because maybe, just maybe, the life you're looking for isn't somewhere else. Maybe it's already here, waiting on the other side of the window. The morning after Sophie's invitation, Emily stood by the window longer than usual. The light came through the trees in thin golden threads, painting her kitchen in soft stripes of warmth and shadow. She watched a squirrel dart along the fence, watched the breeze push leaves into little spirals on the sidewalk, watched the world move on as if it had always been this way. Quiet, ordinary, beautiful. And for the first time in a long while, she felt herself wanting to move with it. But with that wanting came something else. Fear. Because here's the thing no one tells you about finding yourself after 60. It's not the same as when you were 30 or 40. Back then, reinvention felt bold, exciting. like carving a fresh path through a dense forest. But now it feels tender. It feels like standing at the edge of a familiar room and whispering, "I'm still here. Do I belong?" Emily could feel the tug of old doubts curling in her chest. What if I can't do this? What if they don't need me? What if I embarrass myself at Sophie's school? The Buddhist teachers speak of letting go, not as abandonment, not as indifference, but as the art of loosening our grip on the stories we tell ourselves. And Emily knew, deep down, that her story was the only thing keeping her small. That morning, she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the closet in the guest room, the one where she had stashed all her old teaching supplies. The smell of paper and chalk rose up like an old song. Her fingers brushed across storybooks with frayed spines, across hand puppets she had once used to make children laugh, across a faded blue cardigan that still smelled faintly of her old classroom. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by these quiet relics of her past, and let the memories come. The first day of school jitters. The handmade thank you cards from her students. The afternoon spent helping children who struggled to read. Each memory carried a weight, but it was no longer a weight of loss. It was the weight of a life fully lived, a life that had mattered. And just like that, Emily felt the tiniest shift inside her, a loosening, like a knot pulled gently free. She smiled, a soft, private smile, and whispered, "Maybe I'm not finished yet." That afternoon, she found herself walking down the street toward Jessica's house. She didn't plan it. Her feet simply moved, as though some quiet knowing had taken the wheel. Jessica was outside, pulling weeds from the garden, Sophie chasing bubbles in the grass. Emily hesitated at the edge of the driveway, fingers curling slightly at her sides. "Jessica," she called softly, "would you like some help with that?" Jessica looked up, surprised, and then smiled wide and warm. "Emily, that would be wonderful." They worked side by side in the fading light, hands in the dirt, laughter rising easily between them. Sophie flitted around them like a small, joyful bird. And in those hours, something ancient and simple came back to Emily. The feeling of being part of things. Not the leader, not the fixer, just one more human being showing up, offering what she had. Later, as Emily washed her hands in the kitchen sink, she glanced at the window. The wind chime was singing, catching the dusk breeze. She remembered something Michael had once said to her on a hard day. You don't have to hold it all together. That's not what makes you lovable." Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from the deep relief of remembering. That night, before bed, Emily lit a small candle and sat by the window. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, feeling the cool air on her face. She imagined her old stories, the ones about not being needed, about being invisible, about being too old to matter, floating out the window like small paper boats. She watched them sail away in her mind, watched them drift into the night, watched them dissolve into the vast, forgiving dark. And then, quietly, she whispered the words the Buddhist teachers had once taught her. "Let go. Let go." Not because she didn't care, but because she was ready to care differently. She was ready to care with open hands. The next morning, Emily woke before the sun. She'd made her coffee, opened the window wide, and stood in the cool hush of dawn. And then something beautiful happened. Without thinking, without planning, without hesitation, she laughed. A light, breathless, astonished laugh that bubbled up from a place she had thought was long gone. It filled the room. It startled the silence. It was the sound of a woman who had remembered herself. Have you ever felt it? That sudden, quiet moment when you realize you've been carrying a weight you no longer need? The moment you unclench, exhale, and find the world waiting, arms wide open. Emily stood at the window, hands wrapped around her warm mug, wind brushing through her hair, heart steady. And in that stillness she knew she had not lost herself. She had been here all along, waiting to be found. The morning of Sophie's story day arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that barely made a sound on the window but gently washed the world in silver. Emily stood in front of the mirror, one hand brushing her hair, the other holding her breath. She looked at herself, really looked. 62. Wrinkles around her eyes that had deepened from years of smiling and sorrow. Shoulders slightly stooped, not from age, but from carrying things she never spoke of. A body that no longer hurried, but knew how to be still. And for once, she didn't feel the need to change anything. She put on the soft blue cardigan from her teaching days, the one with the loose button, the one that always made her students say, "You look like a grandma from a storybook." It fit just the same, a little snug, a little comforting. She picked out a book, not the newest or the cleverest, but one she used to read aloud every spring. The Tree That Stood Still. About a tree that didn't grow as fast as the others, but gave shade to every tired bird that passed. Before she left the house, Emily did something she hadn't done in years. She stood by the window, looked out at the soft gray sky, and whispered a quiet thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just thank you. Then she stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind that wakes you up gently, the kind that tells you you're alive. This moment is yours. At the school, Jessica greeted her at the entrance with a hug. It caught Emily off guard. When was the last time someone hugged her like that? Not out of obligation, but warmth. Sophie beamed from across the classroom. A dozen small faces turned toward Emily, eyes wide with curiosity, the kind only children can hold. Emily sat in the rocking chair, the one she used to dream of as a teacher, the place where stories began. She opened the book and started to read. At first her voice trembled, but as the words found their rhythm, so did her heart. And something remarkable happened. The children leaned in, every face, every small body drawn into the quiet magic of a story well told. She finished the last page. There was a beat of silence, and then applause. Tiny hands clapping, bright eyes shining. Sophie ran up and threw her arms around Emily's waist. "You were perfect," she whispered. Emily's throat tightened, because it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being there, being real, being willing to offer what she had, even if it was just a quiet story on a rainy morning. After the reading, the teacher invited Emily to stay for snack time. The kids asked her questions. "Do you have a dog? Bob, what was your favorite book when you were little? Can you come back next Friday?" Emily laughed. She answered every question, She promised she'd come again, and something deep inside her, something she had locked away after Michael died, after retirement, after the noise of her old life faded, began to move again. It wasn't just about reading stories. It was about living one. That afternoon, as she walked home under her umbrella, she passed by John's house. He was outside, struggling with a garden hose. She hadn't spoken to him in months, but now something felt different. She called out, "Need a hand?" He looked up surprised, then smiled. "Emily Harris. Haven't seen you out in this weather in years." She laughed. "I've been hibernating." They talked for 10 minutes. Nothing deep, just enough to remember that connection doesn't have to be complicated. When she got home, the house felt warmer, not physically, spiritually. She put the book back on the shelf, took off her cardigan, lit a candle by the window, and sat. She thought about how fear had once kept her behind closed doors, how silence had once felt like punishment, and how now the very same silence felt sacred. She remembered a quote she had once written on the board in her classroom: "To love and be loved, we must be seen." For years, she had hidden, thinking the world no longer needed her. But maybe it wasn't about being needed. Maybe it was about being known. To walk into a room, share a story, and have someone, even a child, say, "I see you." And in that moment she realized something she hadn't dared to believe. She still had something to give. Not because she was young, not because she was flawless, but because she was human, and healing, and real. That night she sat by the window again. The wind chime moved in the breeze, gentle and steady. She watched the world outside, the street lamps glowing, the leaves shimmering under the light rain. She placed her hand over her heart and closed her eyes. She thought of Sophie, of the children, of the cardigan, of the tiny claps, and she whispered, "I'm still here." Not in a loud, triumphant way, but in the way that matters most. Quiet, certain, alive. Have you ever had a moment like that, where you stopped chasing meaning and instead let it come to you? Maybe you don't need to prove anything anymore. Maybe your story, right now, just as it is exactly what the world needs. And maybe, just maybe, it begins again with a single ordinary day. One book, one window, one heart, reopening. Emily didn't know it then, but that one day at Sophie's school was the beginning of something much bigger. It wasn't like she woke up the next morning and her life was transformed. There were no fireworks, no grand announcements. What changed was quieter, simpler. It was the way she began to show up in her own life again. The next week, she got a knock on her door. It was Margaret from next door holding a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. "I heard you were reading at the school," Margaret said with a smile. "The kids couldn't stop talking about you." Emily laughed, feeling the warmth rise in her chest. They stood on the porch for nearly an hour, talking about nothing and everything. The weather, the tomatoes, the funny things kids say. It was the kind of conversation Emily had missed without even realizing it. The kind that makes you feel like you belong to the world again. A few days later, John from across the street waved her over while he was fixing his old truck. "Emily, you've been out and about more," he said, wiping grease off his hands. You look good." Emily felt something loosen in her chest. She smiled and leaned on the fence, chatting about the old days, the neighborhood, the way the trees had grown taller since they all first moved in. There was something healing in that moment, in the ordinary, easy rhythm of connection. It was like life had been waiting for her to step back into it. But maybe the biggest shift happened inside Emily's own heart. She started to say yes more often. Yes to coffee with Jessica. Yes to helping out at the library story hour. Yes to joining a walking group at the park. The first time she walked into that group, she felt her stomach twist with nerves. She almost turned around, but then she remembered the words she had read in her old mindfulness book. Walk as if you are kissing the earth with your feet. And so she walked, slowly, gently. Step by step, she allowed herself to belong. Emily noticed things she hadn't in years. The softness of the morning air, the way the sun lit up the tops of the trees, the sound of her own breath. She realized that healing wasn't about filling her calendar or being busy. It was about presence, about being where her feet were. And the more present she became, the more the world seemed to open its arms to her. One afternoon, Sophie and Jessica showed up at her door again, this time with an invitation. "Would you like to come over for dinner?" Jessica asked. "Nothing fancy, just spaghetti." "Sophie's been asking for you." Emily hesitated, heart thudding in her chest. Old habits tugged at her. The part of her that wanted to retreat, to say, "Oh, thank you, but maybe another time." But this time she smiled and said, "I'd love to." That night around the dinner table, as they passed plates and laughed at Sophie's knock-knock jokes, Emily felt something she hadn't in years. She felt included, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as part of the circle. And it hit her. Maybe she had never really been lost. Maybe she had just drifted to the edges for a while, waiting for her own heart to call her back. The Buddha often spoke of interbeing, the idea that we are not separate from the world or from each other. That, just as a flower depends on sunlight, rain, and soil to bloom, we depend on connection to fully come alive. Emily began to understand this in a way she never had before. It wasn't about being useful or important or busy. It was about being with herself, with others, with life. She started a small ritual each morning, before breakfast, before coffee, before anything. She would open the window, breathe in the cool air, and say quietly, "Thank you," not for anything specific. Just, "Thank you." And little by little, that simple practice began to soften her days. When she walked past people in the street, she made eye contact. When she saw someone struggling with groceries, she offered to help. When she felt that old loneliness rise up, she let it be there. And then she called Jessica, or Margaret, or John. She learned that coming back to life wasn't about erasing loneliness. It was about making space for both solitude and connection, and realizing they could live side by side. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of peach and lavender, Emily sat on her porch, a cup of tea in hand, the wind chimes singing softly in the breeze. Sophie ran by with a group of kids, waving as she passed. Emily waved back, her heart full and tender. She thought to herself, "This is it. This is the life I was afraid I had lost. Not a life of perfection, not a life without grief, but a life with open windows, with laughter drifting in from the street, with a heart that had learned, slowly, bravely, to open again. Have you ever felt like you're waiting for someone to invite you back into life? What if that someone is you? What if today is the day you stop waiting? What if you open the window, take a deep breath, and say yes, not to everything, but to just one small thing? Maybe it's a phone call. Maybe it's a walk outside. Maybe it's sitting quietly with your own beautiful, imperfect heart. Because the truth is, the world has been waiting for you. And you, just as you are already enough. That night, Emily sat by her window long after the sun had slipped away, leaving only a quiet blush along the horizon. The street was still except for the occasional flicker of porch lights turning on, one by one, like little stars rising across the neighborhood. She wrapped her hands around a cup of chamomile tea, feeling its warmth seep into her palms, and listened. The soft whisper of the wind, the gentle rattle of the wind chime, the hum of life just beyond her window. And in that stillness, a truth settled into her chest like a stone gently placed, not heavy but grounding. She was home. Not just in her house, not just on her street, but in her own skin, her own life. For years, Emily had lived as though her real life was something that had slipped away without her noticing, as if everything meaningful had already been written in the past, locked inside old photo albums, folded away in memory. But now, sitting there in the hush of evening, she realized the most astonishing thing. The life she thought she'd lost was here all along. It was in the neighbor's wave, in the giggle of children running down the sidewalk, in the warmth of shared spaghetti dinners, in the breeze through her window and the chime's soft music, in her own laughter as it returned, hesitant at first and then sure. The Buddhist teachers speak often of the present moment, of how everything we long for is already here, if only we would soften, slow down, and open to it. Emily thought about that. She let the idea move through her slowly, like warm tea on a cold night. She whispered to herself, "I'm not waiting anymore. Not waiting to be needed. Not waiting for someone to tell her she mattered. Not waiting for the perfect moment to begin again, because this was the moment. And you, sitting wherever you are right now, maybe in your kitchen, maybe in your car, maybe lying in bed. I want you to hear this. You don't have to wait either. You don't need to fix yourself first. You don't need to have it all figured out. You don't need to erase your loneliness, your fear, your regret. All you need to do is open the window. And by that, I don't just mean the one in your house. I don't just mean the one in your house. I mean the one in your heart. Call the friend you've been thinking about. Take the walk you've been putting off. Offer the smile, the hello, the small act of kindness you've been quietly longing to share. Emily once believed that aging meant closing doors, but she knows now aging is another kind of opening, an opening to simplicity, to presence, to the tenderness of being human. That night, Emily blew out her candle, pulled on her cardigan, and stood one last time at the window. The wind brushed her face, cool and sweet. The wind chime stirred. She pressed her hand to her heart and said softly, "Thank you, not for the past, not for the future, for this moment, for being here, for still having a story to live, And as she turned to go to bed, the window stayed open, because now she knew the window was never just wood and glass. It was her. It was her. It was the part of her that had stayed soft, curious, open to life, even after all the losses, even after all the quiet years. And that part of her, it was just getting started. So tonight, before you sleep, I invite you to do what Emily did. Pause. Take a breath. Open your window. The one in your room, the one in your chest, and let life in. You are not lost. You are already home, and the world is waiting for you, just as you are. And so, my friend, here we are. We've walked with Emily through quiet mornings, through the ache of old losses, through the tender joy of finding her way back to life. And maybe along the way you saw yourself in her. Maybe you remembered a part of you that has been waiting, patiently, softly, to be seen again. The Buddhist teachers remind us, peace isn't something we chase. It's something we return to. You don't have to become someone new. You don't have to erase the past. You don't have to prove your worth. All you have to do is open the window, breathe, and let life meet you right here, right now. Tonight, when the house grows quiet, when the world softens, I invite you to pause. Place your hand on your heart. Whisper a small thank you, but for the beautiful, ordinary, imperfect life you have today. If this story touched you, share it. Leave a comment below. Tell me, what window are you ready to open in your own life? And if you'd like to walk more of this path together, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Here, we explore Buddhist wisdom, gentle healing, and the art of coming home to yourself. Until next time, may you be safe, may you be peaceful, and may your window always stay just a little bit open. Have you ever sat alone in your house at night, the world outside gone quiet, and felt something you could not explain, a weight in the chest, a kind of echo inside the heart? It is not sadness exactly, it is not fear, it is just you and the silence. And the silence, the older you get, the louder that silence seems to become. Why is it that some men reach 50 or 60 and find peace in their own company, while others sit surrounded by memories they wish they could outrun? Why do some grow old and gentle, while others grow old and restless? You might think this is just part of life, that it is normal to feel this loneliness creeping in after a certain age. But what if I told you that the silence itself is not your enemy? What if I told you that inside that silence lives the one thing you have been searching for all along? There is an old story that speaks to this, a story that has nothing to do with gurus or temples or faraway mountains. It is a story about a man and his empty chair, and it might just change the way you see the quiet moments in your own life. So stay with me for a few minutes, because by the end of this story you might never hear silence the same way again. Mike was 62 when the house fell quiet in a way it never had before. His wife, Linda, had been gone for almost a year. Cancer, they said. Fast. Unforgiving. The kind of loss that does not just take away a person, it takes away the sound they made in your life. For months after the funeral, the house still carried her echo. The faint scent of her shampoo on the pillow, the coffee cup she favored still in the cabinet. Mike would catch himself reaching for it and then stop, hand hanging in the air as if realizing again for the first time that she was gone. He kept the porch light on longer than needed. He left the chair across from his at the dinner table pulled out just slightly, as if she might walk in and sit down. The neighbors checked in at first, bringing over casseroles, offering small comforts. But as the seasons turned, so did their attention. People have their own lives. Mike understood that. And slowly it became just him and the dog and the quiet. The house had been their home for 38 years. Mike had worked as a truck driver most of his life. Long hauls, empty roads. He used to love the silence of the road, the way the hum of the engine drowned out everything else. But now the silence inside these walls felt different. It was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that gnawed at the edges of your mind. Each morning Mike rose early. Old habits die hard. He brewed coffee, set out 2 mugs, one for himself, one for Linda. At first it was automatic. Then it became ritual. Then it became memory turned into muscle. His son Dave called every Sunday. "Hey, Dad, how you holding up? You need anything?" Mike always said the same. "I am good, son. No worries here." But when he hung up, the quiet rushed back in as sure as the tide. It was late September when something shifted. Mike was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, dog at his feet. The sun was setting in that slow way it does when the days start to cool. He watched the empty chair across from him. He had set it there on purpose. At first, it was a way to feel like Linda was still close. But lately, the chair had started to feel heavier, like it was demanding something from him he could not name. A neighbor boy, maybe 10 years old, rode by on his bike. He slowed, looking curious, then circled back. "Hey, mister," he called out. "You want some company?" Mike smiled, surprised. "Nah, kid, I am all right." The boy shrugged, grinned, and pedaled off. But as Mike watched him go, a strange feeling stirred in his chest. That night, Mike could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old clock ticking in the hallway. The quiet was no longer just outside him. It was inside him. The next morning, something small but important happened. Mike set out 2 cups as usual. He poured coffee into both. But instead of leaving the second cup across from him, he brought it to his side of the table. The dog, sensing something, hopped up and sat beside the chair. Mike chuckled softly. "Guess you are my coffee date today, boy." The days began to stretch and shift. Mike found himself taking longer walks, stopping to watch the birds, nodding to neighbors he used to pass without a word. He still felt the loneliness, but it was as if the edges of it were softening, becoming less sharp. One evening he pulled the empty chair in closer. It was such a small gesture, but it broke something open. For months he had been keeping the chair at a distance, holding his grief like a shield, but by pulling it close, by letting it be part of the moment instead of a monument to absence, Mike began to realize something profound. It was not the silence that was hurting him. It was the way he had been pushing against it, the way he had been treating it as an enemy to be defeated. The Buddha once said, "It is not the world that abandons you. It is you who abandons your own heart." Mike sat with that thought for days. He did not rush to fill his time with distractions. He did not try to replace the quiet with noise. Instead, he let himself listen to it, and in that listening he began to hear things he had been missing. The rustle of wind through the trees, the soft breath of his dog sleeping at his feet, his own heartbeat, steady and true. The neighbors noticed the change. Mike started joining the Saturday morning coffee group at the local diner. He did not talk much, but his presence was a kind of quiet company that everyone welcomed. One morning, the neighbor boy rode up again, this time with a deck of cards in his hand. "Hey, mister, you play," Mike smiled. "Yeah, kid, I do." And for the first time in a long time, the porch filled with the sound of laughter, of shuffling cards, of simple human connection. But here is the thing. Mike did not fill the empty chair with the boy. He did not fill it with new friends or noise. He kept the chair close, and in doing so, he kept Linda close. But now, instead of the chair being a symbol of loss, it became a symbol of love, carried forward. There is a teaching in Buddhism about the space between things, about the pause between breaths, the silence between words, the stillness between moments. It is in that space, they say, that peace lives. Mike learned to rest in that space. Mike learned to rest in that space, not to fear it, not to fight it, but to let it hold him. One night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, Mike felt something shift inside, a loosening of the grip he had been keeping on his grief. He looked at the empty chair, smiled, and whispered, "You are still here." And in that moment he understood that silence was not the absence of love. It was the shape love takes when words are no longer needed. From then on, Mike's life was not perfect. He still missed Linda. He still had lonely nights. But the silence no longer crushed him. It cradled him. And if you had asked him how he got through the long days, how he found peace in the quiet, he might have told you this: you do not beat loneliness by running from silence. You heal it by learning to sit with it. You heal it by letting the empty chair be just a chair, and letting yourself be just a man, human, still very much alive. The story of Mike is not unique. It is the story of every man who has sat at the edge of his own life and wondered what comes next. What comes next is not a grand answer. It is a small, steady practice of showing up, of listening, of being willing to stay. So if you are sitting tonight in a quiet house, if you are wondering what to do with the silence wrapping around you, remember this: it is not asking you to fix it. It is asking you to join it. And maybe, just maybe, in the joining, you will find that you were never as alone as you thought. Weeks passed, and the days shortened. October arrived with its cool winds and amber light, and Mike found himself drawn more often to the porch in the evenings. He would sit with his coffee, the dog curled up at his feet, and the empty chair close by. The chair had shifted in meaning. At first it was an ache. Then it became a ritual. Now it was something else entirely. It was company. A quiet presence that reminded him that love does not vanish when the body does. One afternoon, Mike polished the old chair. He took his time, his hands moving over the worn wood, feeling the grooves Linda's fingers once touched. It was not about fixing it or making it look new. It was about honoring what had been, about being with what remained. The neighbor boy came around again. His name was Ethan. They had started playing cards now and then, and Ethan had a way of filling the air without making it feel crowded. One evening, after a few rounds of gin rummy, Ethan asked, "Mr. Mike, Why do you keep that chair there?" Mike paused. He looked at the boy, then at the chair. "That was my wife's chair," he said softly. "She passed last year." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then nodded in that solemn way only kids can when they understand something without fully understanding it. "Do you miss her?" Mike smiled, a little crookedly. "Every day, kid, every day." But here's the thing, Mike was starting to understand, even if he had no fancy words for it. The chair had become a teacher. It had become a symbol. And the lesson was this: the things we think will break us are often the things that open us. The Buddha once said, "It is not what we lose that causes suffering, but how we cling to what we have lost." Mike had been clinging tightly to the routine, to the old patterns, to the ache itself. And yet, slowly, gently, the chair had been teaching him to loosen his grip. One night, as the wind rattled the autumn leaves outside, Mike sat in his living room, the chair nearby. He watched the shadows on the walls. The room was quiet, but inside, something was shifting. He remembered how he and Linda used to argue about small things: the thermostat, the way he left dishes in the sink, the shows they watched on Sunday nights. And now in the silence, those arguments had softened into memories. Mike realized something that night. He had been so afraid of forgetting Linda that he had been afraid to let anything change. But memory does not live in frozen routines. It lives in the warmth we carry forward. The next morning, Mike made a small change. He set his coffee cup in Linda's chair, not as a way of pretending she was still there, but as a gesture of inclusion. The chair was no longer a shrine to absence. It was part of the morning, part of the living. That day, he called his son and invited him over. "Bring the kids," Mike said. "We'll have dinner on Sunday." It had been a long time since laughter filled the house. Mike did not expect the laughter to fix everything, but he was learning that the heart is a house with many rooms, and silence does not need to occupy all of them. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Mike found himself leaning into the quiet rather than running from it. He learned to listen not just with his ears, but with his whole being. The sound of the wind through the trees, the creak of the floorboards, the simple inhale and exhale of his own breath. And the chair remained, always there, always teaching. Ethan came by one last time before the cold weather set in. He brought a small potted plant as a gift. "For your porch," he said shyly. Mike accepted it, touched in a way he could not quite put into words. He placed the plant on the table next to the 2 coffee cups, next to the chair. And something inside him softened even more. Buddhist wisdom teaches that we suffer when we resist the flow of life. When we try to hold on to what must change, we create our own pain. But when we let things come and go, like the breath, like the seasons, like the people we love, we begin to rest in a deeper kind of peace. Mike was learning this slowly, one quiet evening at a time. He did not need to leave his home. He did not need to seek out grand adventures or busy himself with distractions. The practice was right there in front of him, waiting, every day, every night. It was in the way he touched the chair, in the way he sipped his coffee, in the way he allowed himself to miss Linda without drowning in the missing. And most of all, it was in the way he learned to sit, just sit, not as an escape, not as a punishment, but as a return. Return to the moment, return to the breath, return to the simple truth that life moves on, and so can we. If you had asked Mike back when Linda first passed, he might have said he would never feel whole again. But months later, sitting on the porch, the dog at his feet, the plant on the table, and the empty chair beside him, he knew something different. Wholeness does not mean nothing is missing. It means we have stopped running from what is missing. The chair was not empty because Linda was gone. The chair was full of every moment they had shared, every laugh, every argument, every quiet evening when nothing much happened, but everything mattered. And in that fullness, Mike found something unexpected peace, not the kind you read about in books or hear about in sermons. The kind you feel in your bones when you stop trying to control life and start letting life hold you. So if you are sitting tonight in a room that feels too quiet, if you are wondering whether the silence will swallow you, remember Mike's story. Remember the chair. Remember that peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of a heart willing to stay open even in the quiet. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you find yourself alone with the silence, you will sit a little differently. Not as someone waiting for the noise to come back, but as someone learning to hear the music that was always there. It was a Sunday afternoon when the weight of it all came down. Mike had just finished a quiet lunch. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and toast. The house was clean, the lawn mowed, the dog fed. On the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, something cracked. He sat down in the living room, the old chair just across from him. And for the first time in months, he let himself really look at it. Not just glance. Not just pass his eyes over it like it was part of the furniture. He stared, and in that long, silent moment, the truth rose to the surface. It was not the chair that was empty. It was him. He realized he had been filling his days with small rituals and routines, hoping they would hold back the tide, hoping the coffee cups, the polished wood, the long walks, the neighbor boy with the deck of cards, hoping all of it would keep him from sinking into the truth he was afraid to face. The truth was this: he was lonely, not the kind of lonely that goes away with company, not the kind that gets fixed with phone calls or visits or hobbies. It was the loneliness that lives in the heart when you have loved deeply and lost deeply, the kind that is stitched into your skin, into your breath, into the quiet moments when no one is watching. And here is where the real turning point began. Mike did not run. He sat in that chair across from the empty one and let the loneliness wash over him. Let it rise, peak, and settle. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering is not the pain itself, but our resistance to the pain. For months, Mike had been bracing against the wave. But now, something inside him softened. He thought about Linda, about their years together, the road trips, the fights over nothing, the way she laughed when he tried to dance in the kitchen, the way she would pat his hand when they watched TV, not because she wanted to say anything, but just because. All of it rushed through him like a river. He closed his eyes, and for the first time he whispered the words he had been holding back. "I miss you." It was not a grand gesture. There were no tears streaming down his face, no dramatic music, no breakthrough moment you might see in a movie. It was just a man in a chair whispering to the air. And yet it was everything, because in that moment, Mike stopped fighting himself. He stopped pretending he was fine. He stopped pretending he was not broken. He stopped pretending he was not still learning how to live in a world where the woman he loved no longer walked beside him, and the world in its quiet way met him there. The wind outside rustled the trees. The dog stirred at his feet. Somewhere down the street a child laughed. Life went on. And so did Mike. There is a Buddhist teaching that says when we stop clinging to what we think we need, we discover what we truly have. Mike discovered this not through study, not through books or sermons, but through the practice of sitting with his own aching heart. He learned that the chair across from him was not a punishment. It was a reminder that love leaves echoes, a reminder that absence is not the opposite of presence, a reminder that the heart, even when broken, can be a place where peace is born. From that day on, Mike's relationship with silence changed. He no longer treated it like an enemy. He no longer rushed to fill it. He no longer feared it. Instead, he made room for it. Some days he would sit on the porch for hours, just watching the light change on the horizon. Other days he would sit at the table, the second coffee cup nearby, and smile at the memory of Linda's voice, soft and steady, calling his name. And the chair remained, always there, always there, always empty, always full. Ethan still came by sometimes, bringing small gifts or stories from school. The neighbors still waved as they passed. Mike still went to the diner on Saturday mornings. But none of these things were attempts to escape the silence. They were his way of walking with it. The Buddha once said it is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles. Mike was learning in his own slow, humble way what that meant. It meant showing up. It meant shutting down. It meant letting the heart speak its truth without shame or fear. It meant resting, not in a house without sound, but in a heart without resistance. If you had asked Mike what changed, he would probably tell you nothing much. He still missed Linda. He still had hard days. He still woke some mornings with a heaviness in his chest. But if you watched him, really watched him, you would see the difference. You would see it in the way he moved through his home, in the way he paused to watch the sun set, in the way he let the dog crawl into his lap without brushing it away. You would see it in the way he treated the chair, not as a tombstone, not as a wound, but as a companion on the road he was still walking. Because here is the secret the world does not tell you: loneliness does not disappear when you fill the room. It softens when you learn to make peace with the emptiness. And that, Mike had discovered, was the real work of the heart: to sit in the quiet, to feel the ache, to stay. And in the staying, to find a peace that no one could take away. The first snow came early that year. Mike stood at the window, his hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the flakes drift down. The world outside had gone still, blanketed in white. The porch, the trees, the old chair, everything softened, blurred by the quiet fall of snow. For a long time, Mike just stood there watching. No TV in the background, no music playing, no phone buzzing on the table. Just the sound of his own breath and the faint creaks of a house settling into winter. It struck him then how much of his life he had spent out running quiet. As a younger man, he had filled every space with noise. Engines rumbled on the road, radio turned up loud, laughter in the bars, even the simple rhythm of conversation over dinner. There had always been something, always a way to push back against the silence. But now, in this house, in this life, it was just him. And the chair by now had become more than just a place to sit. It was a mirror. It reflected back to him all the things he had learned to carry: love, loss, regret, gratitude, and beneath all of it, the slow, stubborn beat of a heart still learning how to live. One afternoon, Mike sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy jacket, a blanket over his legs, coffee steaming in his hands. Ethan came by again, his cheeks red from the cold, his bike tires crunching through the thin layer of snow. He stopped, kicked down the stand, and walked up the porch steps. "Mr. Mike, you cold out here?" Mike smiled. "Nah, kid, I'm just soaking it in." Ethan plopped onto the porch steps, pulling his hat down over his ears. "My grandma says winter makes people lonely. She says it's the season when old folks start talking to their ghosts." Mike chuckled, the sound rumbling low in his chest. "Well, your grandma's a wise woman," he said. "And maybe she's right." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked, "Do you ever talk to your ghost?" Mike thought about that. He thought about Linda, about all the mornings and nights he'd spent talking to her in his mind, about the little conversations he'd had with an empty chair. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I do." Ethan grinned, satisfied, and pulled a small bag of cookies from his coat. "Want one for the next hour?" They sat there, two unlikely companions sharing cookies in the cold, the dog curled up between them, the world hushed by snow. And Mike felt something loosen inside. There's a Buddhist teaching that says peace is not found in the absence of suffering, but in the presence of compassion. Mike realized he had spent so long grieving what was gone that he had almost missed what was still here. The neighbor boy, the dog, the sunrise, the soft fall of snow. All of it was life, still unfolding, still offering its quiet gifts. That night, as he sat alone once again, Mike did something different. He moved the chair even closer, close enough to rest his hand on the armrest. And as he sat there, he closed his eyes and imagined Linda's hand resting beside his. He did not speak. He did not cry. He just sat. And in that sitting, something shifted. The loneliness was still there. It would always be there. But wrapped around it like a second skin was something gentler: acceptance. Mike remembered another teaching he'd once heard, though he could not remember where grief is love with nowhere to go. But now, he thought, maybe love does not need a destination. Maybe love just needs a place to rest. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to ripple through Mike's life. He called his son more often, not just to check in, but to really talk. He invited neighbors over for coffee. He started showing up at the diner, not just to listen, but to speak. And always he returned home to the chair. It was no longer a symbol of what he had lost. It was a symbol of what he was learning to live with. There's a kind of wisdom that only aging can bring. Not the sharp, ambitious wisdom of youth, but the quiet, weathered wisdom that comes from sitting still long enough to hear the truth beneath the noise. Mike was learning that wisdom. He was learning that healing is not about moving on. It's about learning how to stay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the last light faded from the sky, Mike whispered a quiet thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself. To the chair, to the silence, to the life he still had. And for the first time in a long time, He felt full, not because the ache was gone, but because he was no longer trying to push it away. This, he thought, this is how you rest in silence, not by conquering it, but by letting it teach you how to be still. Winter deepened, and with it came longer nights. The town settled into its quiet rhythms. Lights in the windows flicked on earlier. Smoke curled from chimneys. The trees, bare now, etched dark lines against the pale sky. Mike's days settled into a kind of grace. He rose early, made coffee, walked the dog, waved to the neighbors. In the afternoons, he read by the window or watched the snow fall in soft, silent drifts. In the evenings, he sat on the porch with his heavy coat, the dog beside him, the chair close at hand. The chair was never far. One evening, as the year drew to its close, Mike found himself sitting quietly, watching the stars blink awake. The air was crisp. His breath floated in small clouds. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, soft, faint, a reminder of time passing. He rested his hand on the armrest of the empty chair. It was smooth now from all the times his fingers had brushed it, and in that stillness a realization came, not loud, not sharp, but soft, like snow landing on a branch. He had spent so much of his life trying to avoid the ache inside him, thinking that to heal meant to erase. But healing, he saw now, was not about erasing. It was about expanding, making room for the ache, for the love, for the memory, for the moment. Buddhist wisdom says the heart is not a vessel that fills and empties, but a field that expands, and as it expands, it learns to hold everything. The joy, the sorrow, the longing, the peace. Mike had become that field. He thought about Linda, about their life together, about the years ahead without her, and for the first time the thought did not crush him. It opened something wide and tender in his chest. He whispered into the night, "I carry you," not in grief, not in pain, but in the quietest moment, in the space we once shared, in the space I have now learned to hold. The dog shifted beside him, pressing its head into his lap. Mike smiled and ran a slow hand over its back. Across the street, a light flicked on. A neighbor pulled into the driveway. Life moving forward as it always does. And Mike sat there, watching, breathing, being. The chair beside him, the stars above, the quiet, steady beat of his own heart. There's a Buddhist teaching that says peace comes not when we quiet the world, but when we quiet the need for the world to be anything other than what it is. Mike closed his eyes, letting the truth of that settle deep into his bones. He would still have hard days. He would still miss Linda. He would still wake some mornings and feel the old ache stir in his chest. But now he knew what to do. He would sit, he would breathe, he would let the silence teach him, not as an enemy, not as a punishment, but as a companion on the long unfolding road of his life. As the night deepened, Mike leaned back in his chair, tilted his head toward the sky, and smiled. And for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like home. So maybe tonight, as you turn off the lights and the house settles into its quiet, you will remember this story. Maybe you will remember Mike sitting on his porch, a coffee cup in hand, a dog at his feet, and an empty chair no longer quite so empty. maybe you will remember that silence is not here to punish you. It is not here to remind you of what you have lost. It is here to invite you back to yourself. Buddhist wisdom teaches that what we resist most fiercely often holds the doorway to our peace. And loneliness, as sharp as it can feel, is nothing more than a call home. So tonight, when the quiet presses in, I invite you to do something small, something brave. Sit with it. Breathe into it. Let the silence wrap around you, not as a wall, but as a blanket. Because inside that stillness, something waits. Not the past, not the future, but you. The you that is still here. That you... Yeah, the you that is learning little by little to rest in the vast, tender beauty of your own company. And when the sun rises tomorrow, you may find the silence has softened. Not because it has changed, but because you have. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us, to walk this path of quiet wisdom together. Until next time, may you find peace not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet strength of your own heart. Have you ever found yourself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m, replaying moments from years ago? Maybe it's a conversation you wish had gone differently. Maybe it's the career you almost pursued, but walked away from. Maybe it's the marriage that ended, or the apology you never gave. And have you ever wondered why those memories come back in the quiet of the night? Why they press against your chest like a stone you can't quite put down? What if I told you the past is not? What's hurting you right now? What if I told you that regret is not a punishment for what you did, but a signal about how you are living today? There's something deeply human about regret. It wraps itself around the edges of our life like ivy creeping. Along the walls, we tell ourselves stories about what could have been, what should have been, what would have been if only we had been wiser, braver, kinder, stronger. But here's the twist that most people miss. It's not the regret that breaks us. It's the way we refuse to make peace with it. Buddhist wisdom does not tell us to erase the past. It does not ask us to pretend we did not stumble or fall. It offers something much more surprising. It teaches us how to carry the past without letting it crush us. Tonight, I want to tell you a story, a quiet story about a man named Tom. A story about a box of old letters, a pair of tired hands, and a moment when the past finally loosened its grip. And maybe as you listen, you'll feel something shift inside your own heart. Maybe you'll begin to see that regret is not your enemy. Maybe it's just the part of you that is still longing to be seen, held, forgiven. So stay with me, because by the end of this story, you may discover that letting go is not about forgetting what happened, but about becoming someone new. In the light of what happened, Tom was 57 when the weight of regret began to press on him harder than ever. Before, it wasn't that he hadn't felt it. Before, regret had been following him for years, like a shadow. But something about this time in his life made the shadow feel sharper. Maybe it was the silence of his house now that the kids were grown. Maybe it was the ache in his knees when he tried to kneel in the garden. Maybe it was the way he caught himself staring at old photos for just a little too long. Whatever it was, it left Tom restless. He woke early every morning out of habit, not because he had anywhere to be. He made coffee, set 2 mugs on the table. though there was only one person to drink and watch the sun come up over the frost-kissed lawn for a long time. This was how his days began: the quiet click of the coffee pot, the slow shuffle to the window, the sigh that came when the world outside reminded him that life was still moving, even if he felt stuck. Tom had once been a mechanic. He loved the hum of engines, the smell of oil on his hands, the satisfaction of fixing what was broken. He was the guy people called when something fell apart, and for years he took pride in that. But there were some things Tom had never learned. How to fix his marriage had ended 5 years ago, not in a storm of anger, but in the slow, quiet drift that happens when two people stop seeing each other. His kids were kind. They called, visited, but they had their own lives. And there were friendships that had slipped through his fingers, not because of one big fight, but because time has a way of loosening the ties we forget to tend. And then there was the regret that hurt the most. Tom had always dreamed of opening his own garage, a little shop on Main Street where he could work on old cars, talk to neighbors, maybe even teach his son the trade. But life got busy, bills piled up, other dreams took priority, and the shop stayed a dream, stored away in the back of his mind like a tool never used lately. Tom found himself thinking about that garage more and more, not with anger, not with bitterness, just with a deep, aching question. Why didn't I try one morning? Tom sat at the table, the second coffee mug in front of him as usual, but this time his hands didn't reach for it. Instead, they rested on a small wooden box, tucked into the corner of the table. Inside that box were letters he had written over the years and never sent. Some to his ex-wife, some to his kids, some to himself. They were words he had never been brave enough to say in person, words that had waited patiently for the right moment. He opened the box slowly, as if afraid the weight inside might spill out too fast. The first letter was to his son. "I'm proud of you, Tom." Read the words and felt his throat tighten. How many times had he wanted to say it out loud? How many times had he thought about picking up the phone, but decided maybe tomorrow, maybe next time? He set the letter down gently, as if it were made of glass. The next was to his ex-wife. "I'm sorry for the ways I stopped seeing you." Tom closed his eyes for a long moment and breathed in slowly. The room felt heavy, but in a way that was more tender than painful. And then the letter to himself. "You did your best, Tom." Almost laughed, soft and a little bitter. The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign, like a language he had never learned to speak. Buddhist wisdom teaches that regret is not a punishment from the past, but an invitation from the present. An invitation to turn toward our wounds instead of away from them. An invitation to offer ourselves the forgiveness we keep waiting to hear from others. Tom sat with that truth for a long time, longer than he meant to. The coffee went cold. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The dog pawed at his leg, waiting for the walk that would eventually come. When he finally stood, he didn't feel lighter exactly, but he felt clearer. He understood now that regret was not something to outrun. It was something to hold gently, to turn over in his hands, to bless with forgiveness. That afternoon, Tom did something small but important. He called his son. "Hey kid," he said, "just wanted to tell you I'm proud of you." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that holds years of unspoken words. Then a quiet "Thanks, Dad," and a softness in the voice that made Tom's chest ache in the best possible way. Later, he pulled an old pair of running shoes from the back of running shoes. His closet shoes he had bought years ago, thinking maybe he would take up jogging, never wore, and then quietly forgot. He laced them up and stepped outside. The air was cold, but it felt good alive. He didn't run. He just walked 1 foot in front of the sword. A simple act, a beginning that night, as Tom sat on the porch, the letters still on the table beside him. He looked at the sky, scattered with stars. He thought about all the ways he had tried to make the past go away, all the ways he had tried to erase the ache inside him. And he saw so clearly, now healing was never about erasing the past. Healing was about learning to live alongside it. The Buddha once said, "You can only lose what you cling to." Tom was learning to loosen his grip. He was learning to let the past be the past, to let the future unfold, and to let the present moment be enough, not perfect, not painless, but enough. As the night deepened, Tom felt something shift, not a dramatic transformation, not a lightning bolt of wisdom, just a quiet settling, a softening of the edges. He reached out and placed his hand on the wooden box, a small act of grace. And in that moment, he knew letting go does not mean forgetting. Letting go does not mean we stop caring. Why carrying the past as a weapon against ourselves? And for the first time in years, Tom felt himself exhale fully, completely, a breath he hadn't known he was holding. There's a Buddhist teaching that says, as you walk and eat and travel, be where you are. Otherwise, you will miss most of your life. That night, Tom was exactly where he was, on a porch under a sky of stars, letters on the table, coffee, cold shoes by the door, and a heart a little lighter, a little freer, a little more at peace. And as he closed his eyes to the quiet around him, he understood something that no one had ever taught him before. Regret only has power over us when we refuse to sit beside it. When we finally sit, when we finally listen, when we finally forgive ourselves, that's when the real letting go begins. A few days after that night on the porch, Tom found himself drawn back to the wooden box, not out of pain this time, but out of something softer, something curious. He sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun pouring through the window, the steam of his coffee curling up in the cold air. His fingers brushed over the edges of the letters, over the paper worn thin from years of quiet waiting. But this time, his attention drifted to something else. The old pocket watch that had been tucked in the bottom of the box. It was his father's watch, heavy brass with a crack along the face, and a backplate worn smooth by time. Tom had carried that watch for years, but never worn it. It had been a symbol to him of everything he had never become. His father had been a man of discipline, precision, a man who measured life in moments and accomplishments. Tom, on the other hand, had always been looser with time, letting the hours slip through his fingers, promising himself that tomorrow would be the day he fixed what was broken. For years, the pocket watch had been a quiet judgment sitting in his drawer. But today, as Tom turned it over in his hand, something shifted. He saw for the first time that the watch was just a thing. It wasn't a sentence. It wasn't a verdict on his worth. It wasn't even a memory of failure. It was just a piece of metal that had traveled through time with him. And in that realization, something inside Tom softened. Buddhist teachings speak of symbols, not as burdens, but as mirrors. They reflect to us where we are still clinging, where we are still grasping, where we are still trying to control what was never ours to control. Tom stood slowly, walked to the porch, and sat in the cold morning light. He set the watch on the table next to his coffee, next to the letters, next to the life he was learning to hold more gently. And as he sat there, watching the wind stir the bare branches of the trees, he felt something surprising rise in him. Gratitude. Not for the pain, not for the mistakes, but for the simple, humbling truth that he was still here, that he still had mornings like this, that he still had time. It was not the time he thought he would have. It was not the life he had once imagined, but it was his. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The neighbor's dog barked in the distance. A car rumbled down the street. Somewhere a church bell rang. Life kept moving. Tom closed his eyes, letting the sound settle into him like prayer. He remembered a line he had read once in a Buddhist book, though the words had slipped through him back then like water through a sieve. Now they came back with a kind of quiet authority. The past is a dream. The future is a vision. The present is the only place where love can live. And suddenly, the pocket watch, the letters, the regrets, they all seemed smaller, not less meaningful, but less heavy. Tom knew he couldn't go back and change the choices he had made. He couldn't rewrite the conversations, the mischances, the roads not taken. But he could do this. He could be here. He could choose, in this moment, to stop punishing himself. He could choose to open his hands, his heart, his life, to whatever peace was waiting just beyond his grief. That afternoon, Tom surprised himself. He called his daughter, the one he hadn't spoken to in months, and left a message. "Hey, sweetheart, just wanted to hear your voice. No rush, just call when you can." It was a small act, but small acts, repeated, become a practice. And practice, as the Buddha teaches, becomes a path. Later that day, Tom took the pocket watch, polished it for the first time in years, and set it on the mantel, not as a reminder of what he hadn't done, but as a marker of what he was learning to do now. Show up. Show up for the morning sun. Show up for the cold coffee. Show up for the aching knees, and the quiet afternoons, and the phone calls that may or may not come. And in that showing up, he began to find the thing he had been searching for all along. Not redemption, not a reset button, but the quiet dignity of a man learning to live inside his own life. As evening fell, Tom sat once again on his porch, the sky blushing pink and gold above the trees. He held the watch in his hand, felt its weight, felt his own heartbeat beneath it, and realized something profound. Regret is not an enemy. Regret is a teacher. It is the voice that says, "Look again." It is the whisper that says, "Soften." It is the ache that says, "You are still alive." And when we stop treating regret as a wound to be hidden, when we stop bracing against its presence, we begin to hear what it had been trying to tell us all along: that love remains, that forgiveness is possible, that it is not too late to belong to this moment, this breath, this life. Tom closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and for the first time in years he let the weight of the past rest beside him, not on him. And as the stars pricked the darkening sky, he understood, in the quiet way that only the heart can understand, that letting go was not about turning away. It was about turning toward life, toward love, toward himself. A few days passed, and Tom noticed something strange. The mornings felt just a little lighter, not because his regrets had vanished, They hadn't. They were still there, woven into the quiet, waiting for him in the pauses between tasks, in the quiet moments between phone calls. But they had softened, like old scars that no longer stung when you touched them. One evening, as the sun sank low and the trees cast long shadows across the yard, Tom found himself holding the pocket watch again. He turned it over slowly, fingers brushing along the crack in the glass, feeling the weight of years, the weight of memory. He remembered his father's hands, steady and sure, the way they had fixed broken things without hesitation. And for a moment Tom's chest tightened. He had spent so long measuring himself against that man, so long wondering why he hadn't lived up to the same standard. A wave of regret washed over him. Why hadn't he been more present? Why hadn't he worked harder at his marriage? Why hadn't he started that garage he always dreamed of? But this time, something inside him stirred. Not resistance, not guilt, but a quiet voice that said, "Look again." Tom took a breath. He closed his eyes, and instead of pushing the regret away, he leaned into it. He remembered the late nights he had worked to pay the bills. He remembered the weekends spent at his kids' soccer games, cheering from the sidelines. He remembered the quiet mornings when he brought his wife coffee in bed, the way they had once laughed at something small and ridiculous. It hadn't been perfect. It hadn't been everything he dreamed. But it had been love. It had been effort. It had been a life. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the heart breaks, not because we are weak, but because we have love. And that breaking, if we let it, can become the doorway to compassion. That night, Tom did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out a notebook and began to write. Not letters of apology, not confessions of failure, but moments of gratitude. Thank you for the long drives home from work when the radio made me feel less alone. Thank you for the arguments that taught me patience. Thank you for the years, even the hard ones, that made me who I am. The pages filled slowly, one line at a time. And as they did, Tom felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. He wasn't rewriting his past. He was releasing it. Outside, the night deepened. The house was quiet. The world seemed to hold its breath. And Tom sat in the middle of it all, a man no longer trying to erase his life, but learning how to carry it. Buddhist teachings speak of karma not as punishment, but as cause and effect. The understanding that our choices ripple forward, shaping not just our lives, but our hearts. Tom realized that his regrets weren't just shadows from the past. They were teachers in the present. The failed marriage had taught him the value of presence. The missed dreams had taught him the beauty of small, ordinary joys. The pocket watch had taught him that time moves on, but the heart can still awaken. As midnight approached, Tom stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of winter. He looked up at the sky, at the stars scattered like a map he would never fully understand. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to figure it all out. He let the night be what it was. He let himself be who he was, a man learning, stumbling, forgiving. And in that quiet, in that surrender, something opened inside him. A space wide enough to hold his sorrow and his joy, his failures and his hopes, his past and his future. There's a Buddhist saying that goes, "Let go, or be dragged." Tom had been dragged long enough. Tonight he let go, not of the memories, but of the war he had been waging inside himself. And in that letting go, he found what he had been searching for all along. Not a perfect ending, not a flawless life, but peace. Simple, humble peace. As he turned to go back inside, the pocket watch glinted in the moonlight. He smiled just. It was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of how far he had come. And as the night wrapped around the house, Tom knew he hadn't lost his chance at peace. It had been waiting for him all along. Inside the silence, inside the stillness, inside the quiet act of forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to ripple through Tom's days. He did not wake up one morning magically healed. The regrets were still there. The old aches still hummed in his chest now and then. But something had shifted. The regret no longer ruled him. Tom found himself showing up in ways he had avoided for years. He called his son just to ask about his week, not to make up for old absences. He sent his daughter a letter, not one filled with apologies, but one that simply said, "I'm proud of you." He even ran into his ex-wife at the grocery store, and instead of awkward silence, they shared a warm, genuine hello that surprised them both. But the most surprising change was in the quietest part of his life, the mornings. Tom no longer sat at the table with 2 coffee mugs, staring into a silence he could not fill. He kept the second mug, but now it was a symbol, not a wound. It was a quiet nod to the life he had built, the love he had shared, and the man he was still becoming. Buddhist wisdom teaches that transformation does not come from doing grand things, but from small, consistent acts of showing up with an open heart. Tom began to understand that. He found himself walking through his neighborhood in the evenings, not to escape his thoughts, but to be with them. He nodded to neighbors he had once passed without a word. He let the dog pull him toward the park, where he would sit on a bench and watch the sky darken, watch the world go on without his control. Their laughter filled the air, sharp and bright against the hush of the coming night. Tom felt a tug in his chest. For a moment, he thought about the times he had missed with his own kids, the games not played, the stories not told. The stories not told. The familiar ache stirred. But this time, Tom did not look away. He let the ache rise, crest, and soften. He watched the boys play, let himself smile at their joy, and felt something unexpected. Not loss, not shame. Gratitude. Gratitude for this moment, for the cool air on his face, for the sound of laughter, for the quiet miracle of simply being alive to witness it. Buddhist teachings say that when we truly understand impermanence, we stop clinging to life and start loving it. Tom was learning to love life again, not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. Back at home, the wooden box sat on the mantel, no longer hidden away. The pocket watch rested beside it, polished, a little gleaming reminder of time past and time remaining. And next to it, the notebook. Hot pages filling slowly with small moments, small thank yous, small mercies. Tom's days became a kind of quiet prayer. He was not seeking redemption. He was practicing presence. He was practicing forgiveness, not as a one-time act, but as a daily offering. One morning, while walking through the park, Tom saw his neighbor, a man named George, sitting alone on a bench. George had recently lost his wife, and Tom recognized the look in his eyes, the lostness, the heavy stillness. Tom sat down beside him without a word. For a while they watched the trees sway in the wind. Then Tom reached into his pocket, pulled out the pocket watch, turned it over in his hand, and smiled faintly. Without planning to, he said softly, "It takes time, you know. All of it. The healing, the forgiving, the coming back to yourself." George didn't answer right away, but his shoulders softened just a little, and in that small softening, something sacred passed between them. Tom realized that letting go of regret was never meant to make him invincible. It was meant to make him more human, more tender, more open to the ache and beauty of life. That evening, back home, Tom sat on the porch with the dog at his feet, the sun slipping below the horizon. He watched the last light fade, the first stars blink into being, the night unfold like a slow, familiar song. And as he sat there, a quiet thought came to him, unexpected but clear. This is enough, not perfect, not finished, not the life he once imagined, but enough. Buddhist wisdom teaches that peace is not found in the absence of storms, but in learning to stand calmly in their midst. Tom was learning that art, not by erasing his past, but by honoring it, not by forcing the future, but by arriving fully in the present. As the night deepened, Tom looked out at the world around him, then down at his own hands, weathered and strong, and felt the simplest of truths settle into his bone. He was still here. He was still learning. And even now, in this ordinary, quiet life, there was a kind of peace waiting, soft and patient, like a friend who had been there all along. It was late autumn now. The air carried that quiet edge of coming winter, the trees half bare, their last golden leaves trembling in the wind. Tom stood by the window watching as dusk settled over his small town. The street lights flicked on one by one. A child's laughter echoed faintly down the road. Somewhere, a dog barked. A screen door creaked. Life continued. Inside, Tom moved slowly through his home. The house no longer felt like a museum of his regrets. It felt lived in. It felt tender. It felt like a place where a man had finally learned to stay. On the mantel, the pocket watch caught the last light of day. The wooden box sat open, the letters no longer locked away. The notebook waited, its pages half filled, its cover soft with use. Tom picked up the watch, turned it over in his hands, and felt a small, grateful smile tug at his mouth. He walked out onto the porch. The night air wrapped around him cool and clean. He sat down in his usual chair, the dog settling at his feet. Across from him, the second chair remained. For years, that chair had been a wound, a symbol of loss, of absence, of things unfinished. But now, it was something else. It was a companion. It was a memory. It was a gentle reminder that life is shaped as much by what we carry as by what we learn to set down. The moon rose pale and full above the rooftops. Tom leaned back, his body soft, his heart open. And for the first time in many years, he felt no urgency to fix or change or explain anything. He just breathed. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the heart finds peace not by pushing away sorrow, but by making space for it. Not by conquering regret, but by bowing to it, learning from it, and then letting it rest. Tom let the night unfold around him. The stars blinked awake. The world hushed. The past settled into its place, no longer heavy, no longer sharp, just part of the story, part of the man he had become. He thought of his children, of his old dreams, of the choices that had brought him here. And with a quiet breath, he whispered to the dark, "Thank you." Not because it had all been easy, not because it had all been right, but because it had all been his. There's a saying in the Buddhist teachings, you can never step into the same river twice. Tom understood that now. Life keeps flowing, and our work is not to hold the river back, but to stand in it fully, to feel the cold rush around our legs, to know we are alive, and to let it carry us forward. As the night deepened, Tom felt the gentle weight of sleep pulling at him. He rose, stretched, and turned toward the house. He paused at the door, looking back at the 2 chairs on the porch, one filled, one empty, both complete in their own way. And in that simple moment, Tom felt the quiet triumph of a man who had learned the hardest and most beautiful lesson of all, that letting go is not the end of love. It is the beginning of peace. Inside, the house waited, warm and quiet. Outside, the stars turned overhead, ancient and unhurried. And in the middle of it all, one man stood, neither running nor reaching, but resting in his own skin, resting in his own life, resting finally in his own peace. Maybe tonight, as you sit quietly in your own home, you will remember this story of Tom, a man who did not erase his past, but learned how to hold it, a man who learned that peace is not the absence of regret, but the presence of forgiveness. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that it's never too late to return to ourselves, never too late to soften the grip on old stories, never too late to turn toward the quiet place inside and rest. So I invite you, just for tonight, to put down the old weights you've been carrying, not forever, not perfectly, just for a moment. Let yourself breathe. You are not your past. You are not your regrets. You are the one who is still here, still learning, still capable of love and peace. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings. Together, we will walk this path of Buddhist wisdom, one quiet, healing step at a time. Until next time, may you find gentle peace in the life you already hold. Have you ever wondered why, even in a room full of people, you can feel completely alone? Why the praise of your friends, the affection of your partner, or the approval of your family never seems to quiet that quiet ache inside your chest? Have you ever stayed up late scrolling through messages, waiting for someone to reach out, and when they finally did, felt the warmth fade almost as soon as it came? And have you ever asked yourself the hardest question of all? What if no one comes? What if no one comes? One can heal this part of me. We live in a world that tells us healing comes from being seen, from being loved, from being chosen. But Buddhist wisdom offers a quiet, radical truth. The one who has been waiting to heal you is the one you already are. Tonight, I want to tell you a story not about falling in love with someone else, not about finding the perfect friend or teacher or guide, but about falling into yourself, about learning to sit in the quiet and find there the medicine you have been. searching for, so stay with me, because by the end of this journey you may no longer fear your loneliness. You may begin to see it as the doorway to the deepest peace of all. Sarah was 48, and on the surface her life looked steady. She worked as a nurse in a busy city hospital, where she was known for her kindness, her sharp eye for detail, and the way she could calm even the most frightened patient with a few soft words. She was the one her co-workers turned to when their shifts felt too long. When the weight of suffering felt too heavy, she was the one her friends called late at night, when they needed comfort, advice, or simply someone to listen without judgment. And yet, when Sarah came home at the end of the day, the silence in her apartment seemed to wrap around her like a second skin. She would walk through the door, kick off her shoes, and the quiet would hit her with the same sharp ache every night. The kitchen light humming softly, the small stack of unopened mail on the counter, the television remote sitting on the arm of the couch, waiting for a hand to reach for it. She would stand there for a long moment, keys still in her hand, and feel it rising again. That ache, that small, persistent longing, she called it loneliness. But the truth was, it was something deeper. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the absence of feeling truly whole inside her own skin. Most nights, Sarah distracted herself. She scrolled through her phone, checked social media, commented on old friends' posts, clicked through photos from vacations she barely remembered. She texted friends just to keep the thread alive, even when her heart wasn't in it. Some nights she went out for drinks after work, laughing a little too loudly at stories that didn't quite touch her, hoping that the noise of the world would quiet the noise inside. But always, inevitably, she came home, and the quiet was still there. There was a small, cracked teacup on her kitchen shelf. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman she had loved deeply, a woman who had known how to sit still in her own company. As a child, Sarah would watch her grandmother drink tea in the mornings, soft sunlight on her face, a kind of quiet peace radiating from her. She never understood it back then, this ability to sit alone without reaching for distraction, without needing to be needed. The teacup had been cracked for years. Sarah kept meaning to repair it or throw it away, but something always stopped her. One night, after a long shift and an even longer silence, Sarah found herself standing in front of the shelf, fingers brushing over the small fracture in the porcelain. For the first time, she really looked at it. It wasn't even broken. It was still whole. It had survived. And in that moment, something inside Sarah softened. Buddhist wisdom teaches that the cracks in our lives are not where we fail, but where we are invited to let light in. The heart breaks open not to punish us, but to show us where we are still alive. Sarah sat down at her kitchen table, the teacup in her hands. She took a slow breath, felt the quiet around her, and instead of running from it, she leaned into it. She let the silence be loud. She let the ache in her chest be known. She did not reach for her phone. She did not turn on the TV. She just sat. And in that sitting, she felt something she had never expected. Relief. Relief from the exhausting task of performing happiness. Relief from the relentless chase of connection. Relief from the belief that she had to be whole only when someone else saw her as worthy. Buddhist teachings remind us that healing does not begin when we are fixed by another. It begins when we can stay present with our own discomfort, when we can sit with our wounds without needing them to vanish. That night, Sarah stayed up late, sitting at her table, the teacup beside her. She breathed. She watched the moon rise outside her window. She let the ache in her chest come and go, like a wave she no longer needed to control. In the days that followed, something inside her began to change. She still went to work. She still laughed with her coworkers. She still answered her friends' late-night texts. But the difference was subtle and profound. She no longer believed they were the answer to her healing. She no longer believed her wholeness depended on someone else's love. She began to carve out time in her days just to sit. 10 minutes in the morning, watching the sun rise. 5 minutes in the afternoon, feeling her breath move in and out. A quiet moment at night, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The cracked teacup beside her, its broken line now a soft, beautiful reminder. There was one afternoon, months later, when Sarah sat in the park on a bench under a wide oak tree. Children played nearby. Couples strolled past, hands intertwined. Dogs chased each other across the grass. And Sarah sat there, alone, watching it all. For the first time in years, the aloneness did not feel like a punishment. It felt like belonging. It felt like presence. She closed her eyes, felt the warmth of the sun on her skin, heard the soft murmur of life around her, and smiled. Not because everything was perfect, not because all her wounds had healed, but because she was no longer waiting to be saved. There's a Buddhist saying, you yourself, as much as anyone in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Sarah understood now what her grandmother had known all those years ago, that the ability to sit with yourself, to befriend your own heart, is the beginning of true freedom. And from that freedom, everything else becomes a gift. Not a requirement, not a cure, a gift. The love of friends, the company of strangers, the laughter of children in a park. They no longer filled a hole. They simply added to a life already full. That evening, Sarah returned home. The teacup in her hand, she placed it on the kitchen shelf, ran her fingers over the small crack, and whispered quietly, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, not to any moment or memory, but to herself, for staying, for softening, for learning that healing was never about perfection. It was about presence. And as she moved through her quiet home, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world hushed, Sarah felt something that surprised her again. Peace, the kind that does not depend on who comes or goes. The kind that rises from within, steady and true, like a song only she can hear. And in that peace, Sarah understood the heart of Buddhist wisdom, that to heal yourself without needing anyone is not to walk alone, but to walk free. Free to love, free to give, free to be. The days moved on, as days always do. Sarah began to notice small things, not the big cinematic moments that movies promise will change your life, but the quiet, almost invisible shifts that only become clear when you stop long enough to feel them. She found herself standing in front of the mirror in the morning, brushing her hair, and realizing she no longer filled the silence with background noise. No radio, no podcast, no television flickering in the other room, just her breath, the rhythm of the brush, the soft light spilling through the window. She noticed her apartment felt less like a place she was waiting to leave, and more like a place she was allowed to belong to. The couch became a spot for reading, not just collapsing. The kitchen became a space for cooking simple meals for herself. not just microwaving something to pass the time. But the most surprising change was in the way she began to see the cracked teacup. For years, that little cup had been a symbol of what was broken in her. Fragile, flawed, not quite worthy of display, but too sentimental to throw away. It sat there like a quiet reminder that there was something she should fix, something she should get around to repairing, something that wasn't quite whole. But now she saw it differently. One afternoon, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the cup in her hand, sunlight warming the surface. She turned it slowly, watching the light catch the crack that ran along one side, and for the first time it struck her. The crack was not a wound. It was a story. It was where the cup had survived. It was where the cup had been tested and remained. Buddhist wisdom teaches that what we often call broken is sometimes where we are most alive. The crack is not the flaw. The crack is the record of endurance. Sarah ran her finger along the line, a soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. How many years had she believed that she was too much or not enough, too sensitive, too independent, too messy inside? She had waited again and again for someone to come along and say the magic words, to heal the old wounds, to put the pieces back together. But the truth was simpler and harder. She had always been the one she was waiting for. That night, Sarah sat quietly on her couch, the apartment dark except for the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. She held the cup gently in her lap, the weight of it familiar, comforting. She closed her eyes and let the quiet come, not as punishment, not as absence, but as presence. The quiet became a kind of companion. The ache in her chest softened, not because it disappeared, but because she no longer tried to push it away. Buddhist teachings often speak of the beauty of sitting with discomfort, of allowing ourselves to be with what is, instead of running toward what might be. Sarah breathed in slowly, felt the rise and fall of her chest, felt the warmth of the cup against her palm. She began to whisper quietly, almost without knowing, "I'm here. I'm still here." It was not a grand revelation. It was not a moment of fireworks or enlightenment. It was just her, sitting quietly in the soft dark, learning how to befriend herself. The days that followed became a practice. Sarah began to take walks in the morning, feeling the cool air on her face, watching the world wake up. She stopped checking her phone first thing when she opened her eyes. She allowed herself moments of stillness without guilt. At work, she still cared for others, still offered her steady presence to patients and friends. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer needed their approval to feel worthy. She no longer needed their gratitude to feel whole. She gave because she wanted to, not because she had to. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, a coworker stopped her in the hallway. "Sarah, you're different lately. You seem calmer, lighter." "What's your secret?" Sarah smiled softly, her fingers brushing against the small stone pendant she now wore around her neck, a quiet reminder to herself. "I stopped waiting for someone to save me," she said gently. "I started sitting with myself." The coworker gave a puzzled laugh, but Sarah just smiled, nodded, and walked away. That evening, back in her apartment, Sarah made a cup of tea, placed the cracked teacup on the table, and sat by the window. She watched the sunset spill color across the sky, She listened to the hush of the city below, and she whispered again, "Thank you, not to the world, not to anyone outside, but to herself, to the woman who had learned at last that the journey to healing was not about filling the room. It was about filling her own heart, and in that quiet, Sarah felt something she had been chasing for years without even knowing its name. Freedom! Not freedom from longing, but freedom within longing. Not freedom from pain, but freedom within pain. Not freedom from life, but freedom within life. The cracked teacup sat quietly beside her, not waiting to be repaired, not waiting to be made perfect, simply existing as it was, whole in its own way. And Sarah too sat quietly, whole in hers. Winter arrived quietly. The city slowed, wrapped in cold air and early darkness. Sarah found herself walking home from the hospital under streetlights, her breath visible in the frosty air, the hush of winter softening the usual noise of traffic and voices. Something about this season made her even more aware of the quiet inside her life. But now, it was not an enemy. It was a companion. One night, Sarah sat by her window, a blanket over her shoulders, watching snow fall under the dim glow of the lamppost outside. The world had fallen silent in that magical way it sometimes does, when the snow absorbs sound, and all that's left is a kind of sacred stillness. In her hands, the cracked teacup was warm with tea. She turned it slowly, fingers resting on the line of the crack, and let her mind drift. For years, she had run from this kind of moment. She had believed that if she just filled her time with people, noise, and plans, she could outrun the feeling of incompleteness inside. But tonight, as the snow fell and the city slept, Sarah felt something inside her settle. Buddhist teachings speak of the middle way, the path between extremes, not grasping, not pushing away, not drowning in desire, not rejecting life, simply being here with what is. Sarah realized she had spent much of her life swinging between those extremes, longing for love, pulling away when it arrived, craving connection, then fearing vulnerability. But here, in this simple moment, she sat in the middle. She no longer needed to be rescued. She no longer needed to be perfect before she could feel peace. She thought of the patients she worked with every day, their fragility, their strength, their stories. She thought of how often they reached for her hand in the quiet of a hospital room, not asking for answers, just presence. And it struck her, softly but deeply, that this was all she had ever wanted from herself. Presence. Not judgment, not fixing, not endless improvement. Just presence. Her fingers traced the crack in the teacup again, and she felt a small, grateful smile rise. The crack was no longer where the cup was broken. It was where it had been tested, where it had survived. So too with her own heart. The next day, Sarah walked through the city, bundled in her coat, feeling the cold bite at her cheeks. She noticed things she had once rushed past. The sound of birds in bare trees, the steam rising from street vents, the way strangers' faces softened when they caught her eye, and she smiled. Healing, she realized, was not a destination she was walking toward. It was a practice she was living inside, a practice of noticing, a practice of softening, a practice of showing up for her own life over and over again. That evening, Sarah called her sister, a woman she hadn't spoken to in months. No agenda, no apology, just connection. They talked for an hour, laughter bubbling up between them, small stories shared, warmth flowing back into a relationship that had cooled. Sarah hung up, leaned back on her couch, and felt the unmistakable glow of peace, not because everything was fixed, not because the past had been erased, but because she had shown up to herself, to her sister, to the moment. Buddhist wisdom says, when we stop searching for perfect conditions, we discover the joy of this very breath. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the rise and fall of her chest. This is enough, she thought, and in that simple sentence she found more freedom than she had ever known in all the years of striving, all the years of longing. Later that night, as the snow deepened and the city quieted once more, Sarah placed the teacup carefully on her shelf. She whispered again, softly, "Thank you. Thank you to the journey. Thank you to the ache that became a doorway. Thank you to the cracks that let her finally come home to herself." The world outside remained the same, imperfect, unpredictable, unfinished. But inside, Sarah had found something unshakable. Not the end of longing, not the end of loneliness, but a peace deep enough to hold them both. The days began to lengthen. Winter softened its hold, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the city stirred toward spring. Sarah felt it first in the air. A faint, almost shy promise that the cold was loosening. She noticed it in the way sunlight lingered a little longer on the buildings as she walked home. Inside her, something was shifting too. For the first time in years, she felt a curiosity awaken, a gentle pull not of need, but of openness. She no longer sought people to fill a void, but she found herself noticing them more deeply. The barista who remembered her name and her usual order. The elderly neighbor who smiled from his window every morning. The cow worker who shared a quiet moment of laughter over a misplaced chart. These connections were not big, dramatic relationships. They were threads, soft, golden, almost invisible, weaving her back into the world without demanding she abandon herself. Buddhist wisdom teaches that when we make peace with ourselves, we become available to the world, not from emptiness, but from wholeness. Sarah walked through the city and let herself be touched by the world, not consumed by it, not dependent on it, just touched. One Saturday morning, Sarah went to the farmer's market, something she hadn't done in years. She wandered through stalls of bright vegetables, fragrant flowers, handmade bread. The chatter of vendors and customers wrapped around her like a soft coat, comforting but not necessary. She paused at a stall where a woman sold delicate pottery. Her eye caught on a small bowl, pale blue, fine cracks running through the glaze, a pattern called kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks were not hidden. They were illuminated, honored, made beautiful. Sarah ran her fingers lightly over the golden lines, her heart catching in her throat. This is what healing looks like, she thought. Not hiding the cracks, not erasing the past, but turning the broken places into art. She bought the bowl and carried it home carefully, as if cradling something sacred. That evening, she placed the kintsugi bowl next to her grandmother's cracked teacup on the shelf. The two pieces stood together, one old, one new, both whole in their own way. Sarah stepped back and felt something shift in her chest, a loosening, a widening, a quiet, deep knowing. She was no longer waiting for someone to complete her. She was no longer waiting for someone to complete her. She was no longer postponing her peace for a future moment, a future love, a future version of herself. She had become the home she always sought. The next day, Sarah met a friend for coffee. Not because she was lonely, not because she needed to be distracted, but because she wanted to share her presence, her warmth, her listening heart. And something remarkable happened. She laughed more easily. She listened without needing to fix. She received her friend's stories with open hands, not grasping, not judging, just holding space. Her friend noticed. "You seem lighter," she said with a soft smile. Sarah smiled back, a quiet glow in her eyes. "I think I'm just learning how to sit with myself," she said. "And it's changing everything." Buddhist teachings remind us that the heart, once open, becomes the greatest gift we can offer to the world. Not because it is perfect, not because it is healed beyond hurt, but because it is real, present, softened by life, not hardened by it. As spring bloomed, Sarah walked through the world differently. She no longer counted her worth in invitations or phone calls. She no longer measured her days by how much attention she received. She measured them in presence, in moments of noticing, in the quiet, steady rhythm of her own breath. And in that rhythm, she discovered a peace that surprised her over and over again. One evening she sat by her window, the cracked teacup and the golden bowl side by side, watching the sunset paint the city in soft light. She breathed in, breathed out, whispered again, "Thank you," to the ache that taught her how to soften, to the solitude that taught her how to stay, to the journey that brought her home to herself. And as the evening deepened, Sarah understood a truth she had only glimpsed before: that healing without needing anyone does not mean you walk alone. It means you walk whole. And from that wholeness, every step becomes a quiet offering of love. The days continued to unfold in their quiet, ordinary rhythm. Morning light through the window, the soft rustle of leaves outside, the scent of coffee in the kitchen. Sarah moved through her life with a kind of stillness now. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of someone who had stopped running. One evening, as the sky turned that particular shade of twilight blue, Sarah stepped onto her small balcony. Below, the city moved on. People walking home from work, couples laughing on street corners, bicycles weaving through traffic. The world carried on, as it always had, as it always would. But inside Sarah, the landscape had changed. She leaned against the railing, the cool air brushing her cheeks, and closed her eyes. For a long moment, she simply breathed. No fixing, no improving, no striving, just being. Buddhist wisdom teaches that peace is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of spaciousness within it. Sarah had come to understand this not through books, not through grand declarations, but through the quiet art of sitting with herself. She no longer reached for her phone the moment a wave of longing arose. She no longer counted herself incomplete when a night passed without plans. She no longer measured her value by who stayed or who left. Instead, she became a soft landing place for herself. That night, Sarah sat once again by her window, the cracked teacup and the golden kintsugi bowl side by side on the shelf. She traced the lines of gold and porcelain with her eyes and felt a deep, settling breath move through her body. She whispered, barely audible, "I am enough." Not because she was perfect, not because she no longer hurt, but because she had learned the art of staying with the ache until it softened, staying with the joy without grasping, staying with the moment however it arrived, however it passed. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one, like stars rising from the pavement. Sarah watched, heart open, hands resting loosely in her lap, and felt the quiet pulse of life move through her. Buddhist wisdom says, when you make peace with yourself, you make peace with the world. Sarah understood now that the world would never stop changing. People would come and go. Love would rise and fall. Moments of sweetness would give way to moments of ache. But beneath it all, there was a place inside her that could remain. A place of quiet, a place of presence, a place of peace. And from that place, everything else became a gift. Not a solution, not a cure. A gift, the laughter of a friend, the warmth of sunlight, the softness of an ordinary day. Sarah placed her hand gently over her heart and let her eyes close. Thank you, she whispered again, to the cracks, to the gold, to the long, beautiful road home. And as the night deepened and the stars carved their soft light across the sky, Sarah rested in the kind of wholeness she had never known was possible. The wholeness that comes, not from needing anyone, but from finally belonging to herself. Maybe tonight, as you sit quietly in your own space, you will remember this, that healing is not about erasing your loneliness. It is about learning to sit beside it, to soften, to breathe, to stay. Buddhist wisdom reminds us you are already enough. The journey home is not out there, it's here, inside you. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings together. Let's keep walking this path of quiet healing and deep wisdom. Until next time, may you rest. Until next time, may you rest gently inside your own hearts.